Section 1. The show that built its own labyrinth. There is something unusual about the way Family Guy lives in memory. Most television shows, even beloved ones, leave behind a fairly clean emotional residue. You remember the characters, the general shape of the stories, maybe a handful of scenes that lodge themselves somewhere in your chest for reasons you couldn't fully explain. But Family Guy leaves behind something messier, something more tangled. It leaves behind questions. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the kind that keep you up with genuine anxiety, but the slow, pleasant, almost gravitational pull of a puzzle you return to without meaning to. A puzzle that has been accumulating pieces for more than 2 decades and has never, not once, arrived at anything resembling a completed picture. That is what we are here for tonight. We are going to move slowly through this show, through its strangest corners, its most persistently unresolved threads, its quietly impossible contradictions, and we are going to let each one breathe. Not as a checklist, not as a rapid-fire catalog of mistakes, but as a gentle, extended meditation on what it means for a story to be alive for 25 years and still be hiding things. Still have rooms you haven't looked in. Still have hallways that turn in directions that should not be geometrically possible. Get comfortable. If you are listening to this in bed, let your body settle into the mattress. If you are on a couch, let the cushions hold you. The light, wherever it is, can be as low as you want it. There is no urgency here. This is the kind of content that works best when you let it wash over you. When you let your mind follow the thread loosely, the way you follow a river from a window of a slow-moving train. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old. The show was built from a short film called The Life of Larry, then a follow-up called Larry and Steve, and from the very beginning it had a strange double nature. It was both a parody of domestic sitcoms and a genuinely odd, somewhat surreal piece of animation that didn't entirely obey the rules of the genre it was lampooning. It was funny, obviously, but underneath the jokes, there was always something slightly off-kilter about the world it inhabited. The physics were wrong. The timeline was inconsistent. Characters knew things they shouldn't know and forgot things they should have remembered. The show seemed to exist in a kind of permanent present tense, where every episode was happening now, but the past was a fog that could be entered and exited at will, where facts were flexible and contradictions were welcomed, like old friends returning from a long trip. For most of its history, audiences accepted this as the nature of animated comedy. Shows like The Simpsons had already established a template: the floating timeline, the selective continuity, the way characters could age for one episode and then return to their factory settings the following week. Family Guy inherited those conventions and, in many ways, pushed them further. It didn't just float through time, it actively played with the concept of time, of death, of memory, of consequence, in ways that generated genuine mysteries. Genuine questions that the show itself seemed either unwilling or unable to answer, and that is the peculiar thing. Most television inconsistencies are simply mistakes: a prop in the wrong place, a character's eye color changing between seasons, a line of dialogue that contradicts something said 3 years earlier. Those are the normal artifacts of a long-running production. But Family Guy's mysteries are different. Many of them feel intentional, or at least semi-intentional, as though the writers were aware of the contradiction and chose to let it stand, because the contradiction was more interesting than the resolution. Some of them are clearly accidental, but have grown so large, have become so embedded in the fabric of the show, that they have taken on a life of their own. They have become part of what Family Guy is. Tonight we are going to explore all of them. We are going to spend time with Stewie Griffin, the infant who speaks in perfect sentences and builds functional time machines, but whom no one in his family seems to genuinely hear or respond to except when they do. And the exceptions turn out to be just as puzzling as the rule. We are going to trace the impossible age of Brian Griffin, a dog who was apparently born in the year 2000, but who has a son who should have been conceived years before Brian was biologically capable of fathering him. We are going to follow the giant, inexplicably suited chicken who has been fighting Peter Griffin in the streets of Quahog for a quarter century, and whose true origin remains one of the show's most quietly fascinating loose ends. We are going to sit with the dead because in Quahog, death is not the ending it is elsewhere. Characters who died are alive again. Characters who should have died from the things that happened to them walk around as if physics is a suggestion. The town itself seems to breathe with a kind of elastic mortality that follows no discernible rules. We are going to look at money, the Griffin family's finances, which have never, not in 25 years, been coherent. We will think about Quagmire's age, which is printed on his driver's license, and which should make him one of the oldest people in Quahog by a considerable margin. We will spend time with Meg, who is either one of the most interesting characters the show ever created or one of its most underexplored, depending on how you tilt your head. We will look at Lois, whose background has been revealed and re-revealed so many times in slightly incompatible ways that a complete picture of who she was before Peter is genuinely difficult to assemble. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, we will find Herbert, the elderly neighbor whose backstory, when the show finally chose to give it to him, turned out to be one of the most unexpectedly moving pieces of history in the entire series, and whose presence in the neighborhood raises questions the show has never seen fit to fully pursue. Each of these threads on its own is interesting. Together, they form something stranger and more beautiful, a portrait of a fictional world that has been running so long, with so many hands touching it, that it has developed the kind of genuine complexity that usually only comes from things that are actually real. The contradictions in Family Guy are, in a strange way, evidence of the show's vitality. Dead things don't contradict themselves. Dead things are consistent because nothing new is being added to them. Family Guy contradicts itself because it has been alive for 25 years, and living things accumulate history in ways that don't always line up cleanly. So let's go to Quahog. Let's walk down Spooner Street in the dark, when everyone is asleep or almost asleep, and let the questions come to us quietly. The lights are low. The night is deep. There is no rush. Before we go any further, if you are watching this, take a moment to drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. There is something I love about knowing that someone in a city I've never been to, in a time zone hours away from mine, is lying in the dark with the same questions I have. Drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of content that helps you slow down and rest, consider subscribing. There is more of this waiting for you. Section 2: Who can actually hear Stewie Griffin? Of all the mysteries that Family Guy has generated across its long run, the one that sits at the very center of the show, the one that is most fundamental to how the world of the show works, is also the one that has been answered the most times in the most incompatible ways. Can people hear Stewie Griffin? It sounds like a simple question. It sounds like the kind of question that should have a single, clean answer. And in the early seasons of the show, many viewers assumed it did have a clean answer, that Stewie spoke only to the audience, that his dialogue was meant to be understood as internal monologue made audible, that the other characters in the show experienced him the way one might experience a silent, mildly ominous infant who occasionally points at his mother with theatrical intensity. But the more carefully you watch the show, the more that assumption falls apart. Not slowly, not ambiguously, it falls apart decisively, episode after episode, in ways that the show has never chosen to explain, has never chosen to reconcile, and has in fact seemed to enjoy deepening rather than resolving. Let's start with what the show seems to suggest by default. In the vast majority of episodes, particularly in the early seasons, Stewie delivers long speeches, plans for world domination, elaborate criticisms of his mother's parenting, detailed psychological analyses of his own infantile rage, and the other characters simply do not respond. Lois will walk through the kitchen while Stewie explains his latest scheme in complete sentences, and she will ask him if he wants apple juice, and he will pivot from his monologue to answer her in a normal toddler voice, and the scene will move on. Peter will sit next to Stewie on the couch while Stewie delivers a several-minute address about the fundamental inadequacy of the human race, and Peter will reach over and change the channel. This pattern is consistent enough that it establishes what feels like a rule. Stewie speaks. Adults do not hear him speak. The audience hears him. That is the joke. Except that is not actually what happens when you watch closely. Even in the first season, there are moments that break this apparent rule in ways that are never addressed. In the episode where Stewie tries to poison Lois's food, she picks up a glass that Stewie has tampered with and looks at it suspiciously and says, almost to herself, "This tastes funny." And Stewie, watching from nearby, says something in his crisp British accent in response. And Lois responds to what he said, not in a way that could be explained away as coincidence. She responds directly, with a sentence that only makes sense if she heard his specific words. This is either a continuity error from early in the show's history, when the writers hadn't fully settled on the rules, or it is an early indicator that the rules were never meant to be as absolute as they seemed. As the show progressed, the question became more complicated. Brian Griffin, the family dog, the show's self-appointed intellectual, clearly hears Stewie. Clearly and consistently, and without exception. He does not merely tolerate Stewie the way one might tolerate an unusual child. He engages with Stewie as a full conversational partner, responds to his jokes, argues with his logic, participates in his schemes. Their friendship, and it is a genuine friendship, one of the show's most durable emotional cores, is built entirely on mutual comprehension. Brian hears Stewie. That has never been in question. The question is why Brian can hear Stewie when others apparently cannot, and the show has never given a satisfying answer to this. Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator, has addressed this question in interviews and panel discussions over the years, and his answers have been characteristically inconsistent. At one point, he suggested that everyone can technically hear Stewie, but that most adults choose to process his speech as baby babble because the alternative, a toddler speaking incomplete, grammatically sophisticated sentences with a British accent and a detailed knowledge of theoretical physics, is too cognitively disruptive. In other words, they hear him and choose not to hear him, the way people sometimes hear a sound in the night and decide it is nothing, because deciding it is something would require them to get up. This is an interesting explanation. It is psychologically plausible in a certain light. People are remarkably good at filtering out information that doesn't fit their existing model of reality. An infant who sounds like he is delivering a TED Talk is easier to process as random noise than as a genuine communicative event. So you fold it into the category of baby sounds and move on with your morning. But this explanation creates its own problems. If every adult can hear Stewie but simply chooses to process his speech as noise, then Brian's unique relationship with Stewie is not about hearing, it's about choosing to acknowledge what is heard. Brian, in this model, is the only member of the household who has decided to accept what Stewie actually is. Which says something interesting about Brian, about his willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths, but which doesn't explain why, in certain specific episodes, other characters seem to hear Stewie with no ambiguity whatsoever. There is a Season 7 episode, Foxy Lady, in which Lois goes to work as an undercover journalist, and Stewie offers commentary on her behavior that Lois directly and unambiguously responds to. Not once, but twice. There is no possible reading of those scenes in which Lois is responding to something other than Stewie's words. She hears them, she answers them, and then the episode moves on as if this is not information. In a Season 8 episode, Peter has a direct conversation with Stewie that operates entirely on the level of two people who understand each other. Peter responds to specific things Stewie says with specific responses that only make sense if he heard the specific things Stewie said. This is not a case of coincidental seeming response, it is dialogue. And then there is the Season 19 episode, Stewie's First Word, which approaches the question from a different angle entirely. In this episode, Stewie's first official word, his first word in the register of what the family acknowledges as language, becomes a plot point. Which raises an interesting question. If Stewie has been speaking in complete sentences for 19 seasons, why does the family treat this episode's event as his first word? Either they have never heard him, which is the simple version of the answer, or they have heard him and been processing those sounds as something other than words for 19 years, which is the stranger, more psychologically interesting version. The episode doesn't resolve this tension. It leans into it, plays with it, and then sets it down. In Season 23 and Season 24, there are scattered moments, including one that apparently involves Lois having consumed an edible cannabis product, in which Lois interacts with Stewie in a way that suggests full comprehension, and the show frames this as a special circumstance, an altered state exception to the normal rule, which would suggest that under normal circumstances she cannot hear him, but that altered states of perception somehow allow the hearing that is otherwise blocked. This is a fascinating implication. If substances that lower cognitive filtering allow Lois to hear Stewie, then the MacFarlane explanation that adults hear but choose to process as noise has a neurological mechanism. The filtering is not purely psychological, but is tied to whatever brain processes normally handle the categorization of incoming information. When those processes are disrupted, the filtering fails, and Stewie comes through in full. This is almost scientifically coherent. It doesn't actually answer the deeper question, why does Stewie sound like a British adult when he speaks? But it provides a mechanism for the selective hearing that feels grounded in something real. Then there is Chris. Chris Griffin, the middle child, often dismissed as the dimmest member of a household that is not setting a high bar for intellect, has been shown in multiple episodes to hear and respond to Stewie in casual, unremarkable ways. He doesn't make a production of it. He doesn't treat it as strange. He hears Stewie say something. He responds, and the scene continues. If there is a character in the Griffin household whose comprehension of Stewie is most consistent after Brian, it might be Chris, which is either a commentary on the relationship between intelligence and filtering, suggesting that Chris, precisely because he is less cognitively defended, simply accepts what he hears without subjecting it to the processing that would cause him to dismiss it, or it is simply an inconsistency that the writers never worried about, because Chris is not a character the plot depends on heavily. Meg, interestingly, has fewer of these moments than either Lois or Chris. Meg's relationship with Stewie is largely visual. She holds him, babysits him, occasionally interacts with him physically, but direct verbal exchanges in which Meg clearly hears Stewie's actual sentences are rarer than one might expect. There is something almost poetic about this, given how much of the show's treatment of Meg involves ignoring her or failing to fully register her. The character who is most consistently overlooked in the Griffin household is also, it turns out, the one who most consistently overlooks the speaking infant. Peter's comprehension of Stewie may be the most complicated case of all. Peter is not a perceptive man. He is not someone who pays close attention to the people around him or who subjects incoming information to careful analysis. He moves through the world with a kind of cheerful opacity that insulates him from many things. And yet, there are moments scattered, irregular, impossible to systematize in which Peter clearly hears and responds to Stewie's speech in ways that should not be possible under any version of the show's rules. And in those moments, Peter does not seem surprised. He does not stop and say, "Wait, the baby is talking." He just answers. The way you answer someone who has said something to you, this perhaps is the key to the whole mystery. The question, who can hear Stewie, may be the wrong question. The right question might be, when does the show want Stewie to be heard? Because the answer to that question is clear. Stewie is heard whenever the joke or the story requires him to be heard, and he is not heard whenever that is funnier or more convenient. The show has never committed to a single rule, because committing to a single rule would have required the writers to discipline themselves in ways that would have constrained what they could do. The result is a character who exists in a unique state of perceptual ambiguity, who is always speaking and only sometimes heard, who is both the show's most articulate character and its least reliably acknowledged one. He is the ghost in the nursery, the voice that comes and goes depending on who needs to be in the room. And if you think about Stewie's character arc, his early obsession with matricide, his gradually softening relationship with Lois, his deepening friendship with Brian, the slow emergence of a genuine emotional vulnerability beneath the theatrical villainy, the question of who hears him becomes something more than a production inconsistency. It becomes a kind of metaphor for the character's entire journey. Stewie begins the show as a voice that exists mostly outside the family's awareness, and over 25 years he has gradually, incompletely, imperfectly been drawn into relationship with them. Not because the rules changed exactly, but because the show kept allowing the edges to soften. He is heard more now than he was. Or maybe the same people are hearing him and we are just seeing more of the moments where it happens. There is no way to know for certain, and Family Guy seems entirely at peace with that ambiguity. There is something restful about that, actually. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some questions are better as questions. Some puzzles are more beautiful open than closed. Section 3. The chicken fight the feud with no end. There are characters in television history who have become iconic through tragedy, through wit, through complexity of psychology, through the sheer force of brilliant performance. And then there is Ernie the Giant Chicken, a large, bipedal, vaguely humanoid bird in a suit, who has been in approximately the same fight with Peter Griffin since the year 2000, and whose presence in the show is one of its most gloriously unresolved running elements. If you have watched Family Guy with any regularity, you know the pattern. Peter and Ernie cross paths somewhere in or around Quahog. Something happens. A word, a look, a gesture, and then they are fighting. Not arguing, fighting, in the most physical, most extended, most cinematically elaborate sense of the word. The battles between Peter and Ernie are, episode by episode, among the most technically accomplished sequences in the show's animation history. They spill across entire city blocks. They pass through buildings. They involve vehicles and construction equipment and heights that would kill any actual human being. They go on for minutes at a time, long past the point where any normal fight would have ended, long past the point of any conceivable narrative purpose, and they end, more or less, with both combatants exhausted and the specific grievance that started the fight thoroughly buried under the accumulated weight of spectacular destruction. And then one of them walks away. And the show moves on. And the next time we see Ernie, they do it again. The origin of the feud, as the show has presented it, is this. Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. That is the official answer. In the Season 2 episode, Da Boom, a flashback reveals that the animosity between Peter and Ernie began when Ernie handed Peter a coupon for a local restaurant that had already expired. Peter, operating under whatever logic governs his responses to the world, experienced this as a profound personal offense. Ernie experienced Peter's offense as aggressive. Things escalated, fists were thrown, and 25 years later they are still throwing them. This explanation is both entirely in keeping with Peter Griffin's character. His ability to fixate on the most minor slight and elevate it to a matter of existential importance is one of his defining traits, and also, deliberately, almost comically insufficient, an expired coupon. That is what launched this. That is the founding document of one of the show's most elaborate recurring elements. But if you look more carefully at the history of the chicken fights and people have, in considerable detail, the internet being what it is, you start to notice things that the expired coupon origin doesn't explain. You notice that the fights have a quality that goes beyond mere hostility. There is something ritualistic about them, something almost choreographed, in a way that goes beyond what the show's animation team did on any particular production schedule. The battles between Peter and Ernie feel designed. In the same way that a piece of architecture feels designed, there is purpose in their structure, a kind of terrible grammar to the way each one escalates and concludes. Why does Ernie wear a suit? This is not a throwaway question. Ernie is a giant chicken. He has the body of a large bird, the rough proportions of a human being, and throughout most of his appearances he is dressed in business casual attire, slacks, a collared shirt, occasionally a jacket. He drives a car. He has what appears to be a domestic life, including a wife named Nicole who has been referenced in multiple episodes. He exists in Quahog's social world with enough normalcy that his presence at a restaurant or a public event does not cause the kind of disruption you would expect a giant bipedal chicken to cause. This is part of the show's consistent internal logic. Its Quahog is a place where anthropomorphic animals are not unusual, where a talking dog is unremarkable enough to hold a job and attend dinner parties, where a giant infant with a British accent is received primarily as a normal baby. Ernie fits into this world. He is, in the terms of that world, a person. But the suit matters. The suit says something about Ernie's position in the world, his aspiration to a certain kind of respectability, his participation in the economy and the social order in ways that require the visual language of professional dress. And this, in turn, raises the question of what Ernie's life looks like when he is not fighting Peter. What does he do for a living? The show has hinted at various professional identities for him over the years. At various points, he seems to be some kind of businessman, some kind of public figure, someone with appointments and obligations and a schedule, but the details have never been filled in consistently. Nicole, Ernie's wife, is perhaps the show's most underexamined character by proportion of narrative potential to actual screen time. She has been seen, she has been referenced, and the implication of her existence is significant. Ernie is not simply a creature of conflict. He has a home life. He has a partnership. Somewhere behind the fights and the expired coupons, there is a version of Ernie's story that involves dinner at the table and ordinary evenings and the kind of life that most of the show's characters live when they are not in the middle of a plot. In later seasons, most significantly in the Season 23 episode confirmed by writer Alex Sulkin, the show took a step that surprised many viewers who had been following the chicken story. Ernie died. Not as a throwaway gag, not as a temporary death in the show's elastic relationship with mortality, but in a way the writers described as genuinely final. The fight was over after more than 2 decades of combat, after what must be in the neighborhood of 15 or 20 distinct battle sequences across the show's run. Ernie the giant chicken was gone, and the show introduced Nugget, Ernie's son, a young chicken inheriting his father's suit and, apparently, his father's grievance with Peter Griffin. This is remarkable on several levels. It means the feud continues, but the terms have fundamentally changed. Peter is now fighting someone he helped make an orphan. The expired coupon origin story now has a generational dimension. Nugget presumably inherited a family narrative in which Peter Griffin is the villain, in which the conflict is a matter of family honor rather than personal injury. And Peter, who began this whole thing by being annoyed about a restaurant coupon, is now responsible for a son's grief. The show also added something in later seasons that complicated the backstory in an interesting way. Hints that Ernie may not have been simply a civilian who once gave Peter a bad coupon. There were story threads suggesting that Ernie had ties to some kind of scientific or corporate enterprise, that the suit was not merely personal style, but was related to some kind of professional identity that connected him to larger structures in Quahog's hidden world. There were suggestions, never fully developed, that Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's bumbling physician, might have some connection to Ernie's origins. This is where the chicken fight stops being merely a comedy bit and starts to feel like the tip of something larger. If Ernie was not simply a chicken who wore a suit and worked a normal job, but was in some way a product of deliberate creation, of experimentation, of scientific intervention, then the battles with Peter take on a different quality. They are not just two people who dislike each other. They are the surface expression of a conflict whose roots go somewhere deeper, somewhere the show has chosen not to follow. And now, Nugget is continuing the fight. A new chicken in a new suit, carrying a feud whose founding grievance and expired coupon is buried under decades of violence and a father's death. What does Nugget know about why his family has fought with Peter Griffin? What was he told? Does he even know about the coupon? Or has the story been refined in the retelling, elevated from a petty commercial dispute into something grander and more personal? There is also, buried in the chicken's history, a moment that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Meg Griffin and Nugget, Ernie's son, apparently enter into some kind of romantic relationship in the later seasons. Meg, who has spent most of the show's run being dismissed and overlooked by nearly everyone around her, ends up in a relationship with the son of her father's greatest enemy. The show plays this for its obvious irony, but there is something genuinely interesting in it, the idea that the next generation of the Griffin-chicken conflict might be resolved not through combat but through connection, that the thing which divided the families might be the very thing that eventually joins them, or maybe not. Family Guy is not a show that tends to resolve its emotional threads in clean, satisfying ways. More likely, the Meg-Nugget relationship will recede, as so many of the show's longer-form elements do, into the background, available to be retrieved when it is useful and forgotten when it is not. But for now, the feud continues. Somewhere in Quahog, a young chicken in his father's suit is keeping an eye on a large, oblivious man who does not entirely remember what he did, and the next fight is just a coupon away. The violence, in the context of Family Guy, has always had a strange beauty to it. The chicken fights are drawn and animated with more care than almost anything else the show produces. They are long, they are expensive, they are technically ambitious. The show commits to them in a way that goes beyond what the joke requires. There is something in the making of them that suggests genuine affection for the character, for the bit, for the strange, unexplained feud that has been one of the show's most consistent through lines. Maybe that is answer enough. Maybe the chicken fight is its own justification. Maybe the question of why it keeps happening is less important than the fact that it does, that two creatures keep finding each other in the streets of an impossible town and choosing again and again to make this particular problem the most important thing in the world. There are worse metaphors for how people actually live. Section 4, Stewie's Time Machine and the Paradox Problem. The time machine is a football. This is one of the first things you need to accept about Stewie Griffin's relationship with the laws of physics, and it is, in many ways, the most revealing. The device that allows Stewie to travel through time, that allows him to visit any moment in history, to alter events, to potentially remake the world, is housed in a small, brown, roughly oval object that could be mistaken for a sports toy. It sits in the living room. It sits in the crib. It has been left on the floor, kicked under furniture, picked up by people who did not know what it was, and at one point, if memory serves, it was briefly used in an actual game. This is the level at which Stewie Griffin's technological achievements operate in Family Guy. They are extraordinary, genuinely, scientifically extraordinary, far beyond anything actual humans have built or are likely to build in the foreseeable future, and they are treated with the same casual indifference as the rest of the household's belongings. The time machine sits next to the couch. The return pad, the device that allows Stewie to travel back to a specific point, occasionally gets broken or misplaced in ways that strand him in history. The teleporter, when it existed, lived in a room that also contained normal toys. The blasé treatment of these devices is, of course, part of the joke. The joke is that the most advanced technology in human history is owned by an infant and stored haphazardly in a suburban Rhode Island living room. But the technology also generates mysteries that go beyond the joke, because Family Guy, unlike most shows that include time travel as a comedy element, has occasionally taken its own time travel seriously enough to produce episodes that depend on the logic of it, and the logic, when examined, is spectacular. Start with the most famous case. In the Season 7 episode Road to the Multiverse, and even more explicitly in later episodes that built on its foundations, the show established that the universe Stewie and Brian travel through is genuinely multiverse, not simply a collection of comic variations, but a real, branching structure of realities, each of which is as valid and complete as the one they come from. This is standard time travel science fiction territory, not unusual in itself. What makes Family Guy's version interesting is what happens when the show connects it to the actual origin of the universe. The Big Bang episode, and this is one of the show's most quietly audacious pieces of storytelling, reveals that Stewie's return pad, when it explodes, is the cause of the Big Bang. The explosion that created the universe, that set off the 14 billion-year sequence of events that eventually produced stars and planets and life and Quahog, Rhode Island, is the explosion of a device built by a talking infant in a onesie. The universe began because Stewie's equipment failed. This is a bootstrap paradox, and it is one of the most complete ones in television fiction. A bootstrap paradox is a situation in which a thing causes itself, in which the effect is also the cause, and the cause is also the effect, and the whole thing forms a loop with no discernible beginning. Stewie's return pad explodes and creates the Big Bang. The Big Bang eventually creates the universe. The universe eventually produces Stewie. Stewie builds the return pad. The return pad explodes and creates the Big Bang. The sequence has no starting point. It is a circle, perfectly sealed, eating its own tail. What makes this particularly interesting in the context of Family Guy is that the show seems aware of exactly what it has done. This was not a throwaway joke in a cutaway scene. It was a plot point, developed with actual care, embedded in an episode that was clearly thinking hard about what it meant. The writers understood the paradox they were creating, and they created it deliberately, and they left it standing. And then, of course, they moved on. Because Family Guy always moves on. The return pad's destruction raises another question that the show has circled without ever fully landing. If the return pad is what allows Stewie to travel back from wherever the time machine takes him, then its absence should strand him permanently in whatever time period he visits. And there have been episodes in which this is exactly the scenario, episodes where Stewie is trapped in the past, where the return pad is broken or missing, where he has to improvise a way back using historical materials and the engineering knowledge that lives in a one-year-old's brain. These episodes are some of the most dramatically interesting in the show's run, precisely because they take the premise seriously for long enough to see what happens when you do. Stewie alone in the past, without his equipment, without Brian, working with what he has and what he knows, this version of Stewie is more vulnerable than the default version, more exposed. The comedy remains, but underneath it there is a genuine tension, a genuine question of whether this is the version of events from which there is no return. In the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Stewie and Brian travel back to the first episode of Family Guy and interact with their Season 1 selves, which opens one of the most densely layered paradox questions in the show's history. If the Season 10 versions of Stewie and Brian can visit Season 1, then Season 1 Stewie and Brian are aware that they have future selves who visit the past. This awareness is, in the terms of time travel logic, an alteration of the past because the original Season 1 versions of those characters did not have this awareness. The act of visiting the past changes it, which means the future from which the visitors came is now no longer the future they came from, which means they may not be able to return to it, which means the visit may never have happened, which means the change to the past may have been undone before it occurred. The episode does not work through all of these implications. It is, at heart, a comedy episode, and it has jokes to make, but it raises them clearly enough that you can feel the depth of the problem underneath the surface. Then there is the Brian death paradox, which is perhaps the most emotionally weighted time travel event in the show's history. In Season 12, Brian Griffin is killed struck by a car, in a scene that a significant portion of the show's audience found genuinely distressing. He dies. The show mourns him. A new dog joins the family. 2 episodes later, Stewie uses his time machine to go back and prevent Brian's death, saving him. This is remarkable for several reasons. The most obvious is that it establishes, in the plainest possible terms, that Stewie can undo death. Not in a metaphorical sense, literally. He has the technology to reach back to any point in recent history and prevent a death from occurring. This is a capability that, once established, cannot be unestablished. The audience knows it exists. The show knows it exists. And yet, going forward, every character death in Family Guy is colored by the knowledge that Stewie Griffin has a football-shaped device in his crib that could undo it. Why doesn't he use it more? This is not a frivolous question. If Stewie can save Brian by going back in time, why can he not save anyone else? Why does Mayor West die in Season 16 and stay dead? Why do other characters who die in the show's long run stay dead when a working time machine is on the premises? The in-universe answer the show has gestured at is that Stewie's interventions have costs that changing the past creates complications, that the paradoxes generated by his interventions tend to spiral in dangerous ways. In the Brian saving episode, the act of rescuing Brian requires Stewie to strand himself in the past for what is, from his perspective, an extremely unpleasant amount of time, in order to avoid the paradox of overlapping with his past self. The salvation is not free. It costs something. But this answer does not fully satisfy, because the costs seem, across the show's run, to be selectively applied. When the story needs the time machine to work cleanly, it works cleanly. When the story needs the consequences to be manageable, they are manageable. The paradoxes appear when the narrative needs tension and recede when the narrative needs resolution. There is also the matter of Bertram Stewie's nemesis from his own sperm, the rival consciousness who appears in multiple episodes as Stewie's most formidable antagonist. In one episode, Bertram travels back to the Renaissance and attempts to kill Leonardo da Vinci's ancestor, which would prevent da Vinci from being born, which would alter the course of Western civilization, which would prevent the development of sufficient technology to eventually produce Stewie, which would prevent Stewie from existing to go back in time to stop Bertram, which would mean no one stopped Bertram, which means Da Vinci's ancestor dies, which means Stewie doesn't exist. Stewie stops Bertram. The timeline is preserved. But the episode has, in the act of telling this story, established that history is fully alterable, that one enemy of an infant in Rhode Island came close to preventing the Renaissance. This is the level at which Family Guy's time travel mythology operates when it is functioning at its most elaborate, and it is genuinely dizzying. What does it mean that Stewie Griffin is, by the internal logic of his own show, one of the most consequential entities in the history of the universe? He caused the Big Bang. He prevented the erasure of the Renaissance. He has visited every era of human history in a football-shaped device. He is, in the terms of any science fiction framework, an almost incomprehensible power, a being capable of rewriting reality, housed in a one-year-old body, living in a house in Rhode Island, surrounded by people who do not quite hear him. The comedy of this situation is obvious. The poignancy is less obvious but more interesting. Stewie is omnipotent in ways that no one around him can access or appreciate. He moves through history like a thread through cloth, invisible to most of what he touches, capable of remaking the fabric from the inside, and he spends his days in a playpen. There is something in this that speaks to a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of capacity without context, of ability without audience. Stewie can change the world. But the world he most wants to belong to the small, domestic world of Spooner Street, of his family, of the kitchen where Lois makes breakfast, and the living room where Brian reads the newspaper, is the world that is most oblivious to what he is. The time machine collects dust between episodes. The football sits in the corner, and Stewie watches morning television and waits for whatever comes next. Section 5. The Death Problem Characters Who Should Not Still Be Here. Quahog is a town with a complicated relationship with permanence. This is not unusual for animated television. The genre has always had a loose relationship with consequence characters bounce back from injuries that would be catastrophic in reality. Events that should change everything are forgotten by the following episode, and death, when it occurs, is often a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent state. The floating timeline, the selective continuity, the elastic reality, these are the tools of long-running animation, and audiences have understood this for as long as there has been long-running animation. But Family Guy's relationship with death is unusual even within this tradition. It is not simply that characters survive things they shouldn't survive. It is that the show has, over the years, developed what amounts to a theology of mortality, a set of rules about who can die, how dead they can be, how long they stay dead, and what their return means for the people around them, and that theology is internally inconsistent in ways that are fascinating to map. Start with the most famous case, because it is the one that clarified the show's approach to death more clearly than anything else in its history. Brian Griffin died in season 12, not in a cutaway gag, not in a flash forward, not in an alternate universe. Brian was struck by a car on Spooner Street, in the main continuity of the show, and he died of his injuries, and the family mourned him, and the show continued for 2 episodes without him, introducing a new dog named Vinny, who was actually quite well received by segments of the audience who thought a permanent change in the status quo might be interesting. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie Griffin used his time machine to go back and push Brian out of the way of the car. Brian was alive again. Vinny was gone. The show returned to its baseline configuration. This decision was controversial among longtime viewers, and the controversy is worth examining because it reveals something important about what kind of show Family Guy is and is not. A segment of the audience felt that Brian's death was a meaningful narrative event, that it had cost something real, that the 2 episodes without him had established a new world that had its own emotional validity, and that the reversal cheapened what had been earned. Another segment was simply relieved that a beloved character was back. But both groups were reacting to the same underlying fact. Family Guy made a decision about what kind of permanence it could bear. It decided, when it came to it, that Brian's death was not something it wanted to live with. This is not a criticism, it is information. It tells you that the show's emotional core is configured in certain ways, that certain things are load-bearing, that the architecture of the world depends on particular pieces remaining in place. Which then raises the question of why other deaths in the show have been treated differently. Mayor Adam West died in season 16, in an episode that was clearly marked as a tribute to Adam West, the actor who had voiced the character since the show's beginning, who died in June 2017. The episode was written with evident care and genuine emotion. Mayor West's death was acknowledged as permanent. The character was not brought back in the following weeks. The town of Quahog mourned him, and the show moved on without him. And to this day, Mayor Adam West is one of the show's permanent absences, a hole in the world of Quahog that has never been refilled. The contrast between Brian's death and Mayor West's death tells you everything you need to know about how the show thinks about mortality. Brian's death was restorable because Brian is part of the structural core of Family Guy. His relationship with Stewie, his role in the family, his particular voice in the show's world are things the show couldn't easily do without. Mayor West's death was permanent because it was a real death being honored because Adam West was gone and there was no meaningful version of bringing the character back, and because to do so would have been a disservice to what the episode was actually doing. Both decisions are defensible. Together, they reveal that death in Family Guy is situational. It means what the show needs it to mean, and its permanence is determined by factors that have as much to do with production and intent as with any internal logic. Then there is the case of characters who died and came back not through time travel, but simply through the show's willingness to not address the contradiction. Kevin Swanson, Joe and Bonnie's son, who went off to fight in Iraq, was declared dead in an early season. His death was a plot point. Joe grieved, The family grieved, Kevin was gone, and then, in season 10, Kevin was back, alive. Not explained, not acknowledged as strange, simply present again. The show had killed him and forgotten about it, and brought him back when it was useful. This is the category of death that is most characteristic of long-running television, the death that is remembered incorrectly or not remembered at all, the death that existed in the show's continuity for long enough to be used, and then was quietly set aside when the character became useful again. Kevin's return was handled with enough charm that most viewers accepted it, but it established definitively that death in Quahog is not a reliable endpoint. Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy is a different kind of death-adjacent mystery, not a death, but an impossible persistence. Bonnie was pregnant when she first appeared. She remained pregnant for approximately 6 seasons. 6 seasons of television, which in real time amounts to several years, during which Bonnie's pregnancy was a standing fact of the show's world, referenced and acknowledged and used in jokes, but never concluded. The pregnancy simply continued, immune to the passage of time that would govern any actual pregnancy. When Susie the Swanson's daughter was finally born, the show treated it as an event of some significance. But the 6-season gestation is one of those quiet absurdities that Family Guy accumulated over the years and never seemed to notice had become strange. A pregnancy that lasted 6 seasons is not a pregnancy in any meaningful sense. It is a status, a permanent descriptive fact about a character that was never intended to resolve into consequence, but which eventually had to because the audience's awareness of how long it had been going on became part of the joke. Stewie himself presents a mortality paradox that the show has touched without fully engaging. If Stewie has a working time machine and has demonstrated the ability to prevent deaths by going back and altering events, then Stewie is, functionally, immortal, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that any death he suffers could simply be undone by a future version of himself. But Stewie has died in various episodes, and those deaths are not always undone. The show applies the time travel safety net selectively, which means either that Stewie chooses not to save himself from certain deaths, which implies a philosophical willingness to accept some ends that he doesn't apply to Brian, or that the show simply isn't tracking its own rules carefully enough to notice the inconsistency. Then there is Peter Griffin himself, whose survival statistics are one of the show's most impressive running achievements. Peter has fallen from great heights. Peter has been shot, stabbed, beaten by chickens, crushed by heavy objects, consumed in explosions, and subjected to medical interventions that should have ended him. He has survived all of it. Not because the show has given him any particular explanation for his durability, not because he is specially enhanced or particularly lucky, but because Peter Griffin is Peter Griffin, and Quahog's physical laws bend around him the way water bends around a rock. There is a scene in a later season where Peter actually fights God, the deity, in the show's cosmology, appearing to settle a dispute with Peter, and the fight is ambiguous enough in its outcome that you are left with the sense that Peter Griffin might actually, on some level, be more durable than divinity. This is either the show's most extreme expression of its protagonist's imperviousness, or it is another moment in which Family Guy lost track of the scale of what it was doing and produced something more theologically interesting than it intended. The show's treatment of death, considered across all of these cases, produces a picture that is not chaotic but is genuinely distinctive. The rules are not arbitrary, there is a logic, it's just not a simple one. Important characters can die and be restored if their absence would damage the show's core. Real deaths, deaths of actual people connected to characters, are treated with permanent respect. Characters who were killed by accident or editorial oversight can be brought back without explanation. The protagonist cannot die in any meaningful way, and secondary characters occupy a middle ground in which their mortality is determined episode by episode, depending on what the story needs. This is not the logic of physics. It is the logic of storytelling, of a writer's room making decisions in real time about what kind of world they want to live in and what kinds of losses they are willing to sustain. Family Guy's relationship with death is, in the end, a relationship between the show and its own attachment to its characters, to its audience, to the particular configuration of voices and presences that have defined it for 25 years. Death in Quahog is real. It just is not necessarily final. And in the dark, late at night, with the questions settling gently around you, there is something almost comforting in that. Not everything that ends stays ended. Not every loss is permanent. Sometimes the time machine works, and the one you lost comes back, and the world folds back into the shape it was supposed to be. Section 6, Brian Griffin's age and the timeline that refuses to add up. Brian Griffin is 8 years old. Brian Griffin is also, depending on which episode you are watching and which piece of dialogue you are weighing against which other piece of dialogue, somewhere between 7 and 10 years old. Born in January of the year 2000, or possibly present in the Griffin household before 1999 began, or possibly a stray that was found by the family as an adult, or possibly raised from puppyhood in the Griffin home, or possibly born off-screen to a litter that Peter witnessed, or possibly all of these things simultaneously in a timeline that has been folded so many times it no longer opens flat. Brian Griffin's age and history are one of the show's most lovingly complicated inconsistencies, and the depth of the problem only reveals itself when you try to sit down and actually work out what the show has told you. Here is what we know, or think we know, starting from the most concrete available information. In the Season 4 episode, Brian Goes Back to College, Brian mentions that he is 8 years old. This is a direct first-person statement about his own age, not a calculation, not an inference, but Brian telling us a fact about himself. 8 years old. At the time of Season 4, which aired in 2005 and 2006, this places his birth roughly around 1997 or 1998, depending on where in the season he said it. Except that in the Season 8 episode, Brian's got a brand new bag. Brian states that he is 7 years old. Season 8 aired in 2010. If we take both statements at face value, Brian got younger as the show progressed, which either means the floating timeline has caused him to de-age, or one of the two statements is simply wrong, or the show was not tracking Brian's age carefully enough to maintain consistency. Neither of these explanations is satisfying. The floating timeline explanation would require Brian to be aging at a different rate than the surrounding world, which creates problems for his interactions with the human characters around him who are not de-aging. The error explanation is plausible but uninteresting. What is more interesting is what both statements together reveal about the show's relationship with Brian's continuity. It is a relationship of selective attention, in which facts about Brian are deployed when they serve a purpose, and quietly set aside when they complicate the picture. Now add the matter of Dylan. Dylan Flanagan is Brian's son, introduced in Season 6 Inches, an episode that revealed Brian had fathered a child during a relationship with a woman named Tracy Flanagan. Dylan is introduced as a 13-year-old boy. The episode aired in 2007 or 2008. Do the math. If Brian is 7 or 8 years old during these middle seasons, and Dylan is 13, then Dylan is older than Brian. Brian's son is 5 or 6 years older than Brian himself, which is the kind of biological impossibility that not even the most generous application of fictional logic can accommodate. Dogs do not father children before they are born. The timeline does not work. There are a few attempted explanations. One is that dog years are being applied inconsistently, that when Brian says he is 7 or 8, he means 7 or 8 in human years, but that his biological age is actually several years older, and that his relationship with Tracy occurred during a period of his life that predates the narrative, but not his biological development. This would require Brian to be sexually mature at a biological age that corresponds to 13 or 14 human years, which is within the range of canine biology, but then to have his human years age reported as lower than his son's age, which still produces a confusing picture. Another attempted explanation is that Brian was not 1 year old when the show began, that his actual history stretches further back than the show has consistently represented. This would mean that the Griffin family had Brian before Season 1, possibly for several years before Season 1, and that the show's pilot is not actually the beginning of Brian's life in the Griffin household, but rather a snapshot of a relationship already in progress. There is evidence for this. In certain episodes, flashback sequences show Brian as a puppy in the Griffin home, suggesting that the Griffins raised him from early in his life. This would push Brian's birth back before 1999, which would make his age in the middle seasons more coherent, 8 or 9 in human years, born sometime in the early 1990s, which would allow Dylan's 13-year-old existence to make biological sense. But then there are other episodes, and here is where the contradiction deepens, that suggest Brian was found as an adult stray, that he was already a grown dog when he came to live with the Griffin family, that his puppyhood was spent elsewhere. These episodes directly contradict the puppy in the Griffin home flashbacks, and the show has never chosen between them. What this means, in practical terms, is that Brian has at least two incompatible backstories that coexist in the show's continuity. He was raised as a puppy by the Griffins. He was also found as an adult. Both of these things are presented as true in different episodes, and the show has never addressed the contradiction, possibly because it does not notice it, possibly because the writers of different episodes did not check what other episodes had established. Brian's academic history adds another layer. In Brian Goes Back to College, the central plot involves Brian returning to Brown University to complete the undergraduate degree he never finished. Brown University is a real institution in Providence, Rhode Island, which places it geographically close to Quahog in the show's internal geography. The episode establishes that Brian attended Brown at some point, dropped out, and has been living with the sense of that unfinished business for years. But when exactly did Brian attend Brown? If Brian is 7 or 8 years old in the human years reckoning, he cannot have attended a university at all his entire life. To that point would have corresponded to early childhood in human developmental terms. If we use dog years, a 7-year-old dog corresponds to roughly 49 to 56 human years, depending on the breed, which would make Brian's Brown attendance possible, but which would also make him, in human equivalent terms, a middle-aged or even elderly man who has been living as an undergraduate dropout for decades. The show has never committed to which frame of reference applies to Brian's age. He seems to be simultaneously a young man in the sense of his social status, his romantic aspirations, his cultural references, his sense of being at the beginning of adult life rather than the middle or the end, and an entity of considerable biological age, in the sense of a dog who has been alive for multiple human years equivalents. These two identities coexist without resolution, and Brian navigates both of them in different episodes without the show appearing to notice the tension. There is also the matter of Brian's parents, which the show has visited briefly and confusingly. Brian's mother, Biscuit, was a dog who was euthanized when Brian was young, and the episode that dealt with this was genuinely affecting it, gave Brian a backstory rooted in actual canine experience, a reminder that however human-presenting he is also a dog and his life has the contours of a dog's life, including the loss that comes from a dog's shorter lifespan relative to the humans around him. His father, who also appeared in at least one episode, added to a backstory that has never been fully assembled into a coherent whole. What strikes me most about Brian's timeline is not the inconsistency itself. Many long-running shows have inconsistent character histories, but the specific quality of the inconsistency. It feels like the show wanted Brian to be several different things at once. A young man finding his way, a middle-aged disappointment nursing old wounds, a dog with a dog's history, a human with a human's ambitions. And it tried to have all of these things simultaneously, without working out how they fit together chronologically. The result is a character who feels emotionally coherent, whose trajectory as a person makes a kind of psychological sense, even when his biography doesn't, but whose timeline is a beautiful mess. Brian Griffin is however old he needs to be in any given episode. He was born whenever would make the current story work. He has the history that is most useful for the scene he is in. And he carries all of these incompatible pasts with the same easy grace he brings to everything else, the glass of white wine, the half-finished novel, the slightly too formal way he sits at the dinner table. He is, for all his flaws and contradictions, one of the most fully imagined characters in 25 years of animation. It is perhaps fitting that his biography is impossible to pin down. The most interesting people usually are. Section 7 Quagmire, the 6-1 year. Old mystery in a Hawaiian shirt. In the Season 7 episode Foxy Lady, a driver's license belonging to Glenn Quagmire is briefly visible on screen. The license states that Quagmire was born on the 4th of April, 1948. The episode aired in 2009. This means that at the time of that episode's airing, the show was presenting Glenn Quagmire as 61 years old. 61. The man in the Hawaiian shirt who lives next door to the Griffins, who has been pursuing women with undiminished enthusiasm since the show began, whose energy and physical capacity and overall presentation reads as somewhere in the range of late 30s to mid-40s, was born the year after the Marshall Plan was implemented, and the year the Berlin airlift began. This is either the show's most brazen piece of age-related fiction or it is a clue to something genuinely interesting about Quagmire's character that has never been fully developed. And the more you look at it, the more the second possibility becomes compelling. If Quagmire was born in 1948, then certain things about his history need to be reconsidered in that light. He would have been a young man during the late 1960s, a period of extraordinary social upheaval, of the Vietnam War, of the cultural revolutions that reshaped American life in ways that still define the country today. He would have come of age in an era that produced a particular kind of man, a man defined by a set of attitudes about freedom, about personal expression, about the relationship between individual desire and social constraint that was shaped by the specific pressures of that historical moment. There is something in this that explains Quagmire more coherently than any other framework the show has offered. Quagmire's sexual philosophy, his relentless, largely unapologetic, frequently illegal pursuit of romantic and sexual encounters, reads as the behavior of a man shaped by a specific historical moment, a man who came of age when certain kinds of behavior were being liberated from their previous social constraints, and who took that liberation to its absolute logical extreme and never updated the framework. He is not simply a lecher, he is a period piece. He is what happens when the free love philosophy of the late 1960s is applied by someone who absorbed its permission structures without internalizing any of its underlying values around genuine human connection. This reading makes Quagmire both more interesting and more troubling than the show's default treatment of him tends to suggest. He is not just funny. He is a time capsule, a man who is, psychologically and culturally, still living in 1971, who has never quite accepted that the world moved on. The Hawaiian shirts, which read as aesthetic signature, could also be read as period dress as the casual resort wear of a man whose wardrobe was formed during a specific moment in American leisure culture and has not significantly evolved since. But the 1948 birth year creates mathematical problems for other established facts about Quagmire's history. In various episodes, the show has depicted or referenced Quagmire attending high school. If those high school scenes are set in what appears to be the 1970s or 1980s based on their visual presentation, they would correspond to a Quagmire in his 20s or 30s at the time, old for high school, even if we allow for some dramatic flexibility. And in certain episodes, the high school flashbacks look more like the 1980s than the 1960s, which would place a 1948 born Quagmire at age 35 to 40 during those scenes. The show has placed Quagmire's high school years in different periods in different episodes, which suggests that either his birth year was an error that the writers didn't track, or the high school scenes were written independently of the birth year data, or both. Quagmire's father, introduced in a memorable episode as Ida Davis, a transgender woman who had undergone gender confirmation surgery, adds a layer to Quagmire's backstory that the show handled with more care than many expected, though the episode's handling of trans identity is complicated and has been discussed at length elsewhere. What is relevant here is what the episode reveals about Quagmire's family history and how it shapes his character. Quagmire's response to his father's transition, initially horrified, gradually softening into something approaching acceptance, is one of the few times the show has shown Quagmire processing genuinely challenging personal information in a way that leads to growth rather than regression. This is interesting because it points toward a version of Quagmire that the show has occasionally suggested but rarely committed to, a version in which the bravado and the relentless performance of masculine confidence is a response to something more complicated underneath. A man born in 1948 who grew up in a household with a parent whose gender identity was suppressed throughout his childhood, the emotional complexity of that situation, the specific set of confusions and displacements it might produce, is genuinely rich territory. The show has touched it and moved on, as it tends to do. Quagmire also has a daughter, Anna Lee Quagmire, who appears in Season 9 Inches, the episode Quagmire's Baby. A woman he had a one-night stand with leaves a baby on his doorstep, and the episode follows Quagmire attempting to raise a child he was not prepared for, and ultimately placing her for adoption with a couple who can provide a more stable environment. It is one of the show's more genuinely affecting storylines about Quagmire because it reveals that beneath the relentless pursuit of casual encounters is a man capable of recognizing his own limitations and making a painful decision in someone else's interest. Annalee's story does not end with the adoption episode. She reappears in later seasons, and the thread of Quagmire's complicated relationship with fatherhood, with the gap between the person he presents to the world and the person who might have been capable of something more stable and sustaining, is one of the show's most underdeveloped but most emotionally loaded secondary narratives. There is also a son, somewhere in Madrid, who was referenced in a later season and who exists as one of the many scattered pieces of Quagmire's off-screen life that the show has introduced and then mostly left to fend for themselves in the viewer's imagination. A son in Madrid, a daughter placed for adoption in New England, a father who transitioned, a birth year that places him in his 60s while he looks and acts like he is in his early 40s. A career as a commercial airline pilot that requires a level of professional competence and regulatory compliance that sits uneasily with the rest of his lifestyle. An apartment that adjoins the Griffin home and that the show has used as a setting for situations that range from comedic to genuinely dark. Quagmire is, considered fully, one of the show's most layered characters, a man whose surface presentation is the show's most consistent source of one specific kind of humor, but whose actual history, when you try to assemble it, contains enough genuine complexity to support a much more searching kind of story than Family Guy has ever chosen to tell about him. The 61-year-old in the Hawaiian shirt, the airline pilot with the unlisted number of children, the man who came of age during the most turbulent decades of the 20th century and who carries some of that history in a way the show has acknowledged just enough to make you wish it had gone further. He giggles and moves on. The Hawaiian shirt never changes. And somewhere in Madrid, someone carries his last name without knowing much about him at all. Section 8. The Griffin family's Money a Mystery everyone can relate to. Let us talk about the house. The Griffin family home at 31 Spooner Street is a two-story house with a basement, an attic, at least 4 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a living room, a dining room, a family room area visible in various episodes, and a garage. It is located in what appears to be a reasonably maintained middle-class neighborhood in Quahog, Rhode Island, which, given Rhode Island's cost of living, which has historically been above the national average, represents a not insignificant piece of real estate. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. Before that, he worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. Neither of these positions has ever been clearly described as lucrative. Various pieces of dialogue across the show's run have placed Peter's salary in the range of $40,000 to $55,000 annually. In one episode, a note from Carter Pewterschmidt Lois's wealthy father makes a comment that roughly translates to incredulity, that Peter is supporting 3 children on approximately $40,000 per year. $40,000 per year in Rhode Island, with a mortgage on a 4-bedroom house, 3 children, a dog, and a lifestyle that includes regular dinners out, a consistent tab at a bar, and occasional expenditures that would strain even a generous budget, is not mathematically coherent. It has never been mathematically coherent. The show knows this. Carter's note is evidence that the writers are aware of the gap between Peter's stated income and the Griffin's apparent lifestyle, and has never tried to make it coherent, because coherence is not what the show is for. But the money mystery goes deeper than the simple question of how the Griffins afford their house. It goes into something stranger and more interesting: the show's relationship with wealth as a transformative state, and its repeated willingness to give the Griffins access to enormous resources, only to return them to their baseline configuration the following week as if nothing happened. In Season 10, the Griffins win the lottery. This is presented as a significant event. The family suddenly has access to money that should, by any reasonable projection, change their lives permanently. They spend lavishly. They experience the life that wealth makes possible. And then, within a remarkably short span of episodes, the money is gone. Spent or lost or otherwise dispersed in ways the show doesn't linger over, and the Griffins are back at 31 Spooner Street in the same configuration they started in. This is the elastic financial reset, the same device that Family Guy applies to so many other aspects of its world. Wealth arrives, is experienced, and is taken away, because the show's identity depends on the Griffins being a working-class family in a particular kind of material circumstance. They are not meant to be rich. They are not meant to be so poor that their material circumstances become the story. They are meant to occupy that specific middle register, slightly stretched, occasionally desperate, consistently unable to get ahead because that is the register in which their particular kind of comedy operates. Lois's family represents everything the Griffins are not, financially. The Pewterschmidts are old money, the kind of wealth that has been accumulated over generations, that expresses itself not just in possessions but in manner and assumption, that shapes the way people move through the world even when they are not consciously thinking about money. Carter Pewterschmidt is, by every indication the show has provided, extraordinarily wealthy. He has estates, he has staff, he has the kind of resources that allow him to affect the lives of people around him simply by choosing to or choosing not to. And yet Lois, who grew up in that world, chose Peter. This is one of the show's most persistently interesting unexplained decisions. Lois Griffin, educated, cultured, from a family of significant means, apparently possessed of enough personal assets when she married Peter to make the Spooner Street mortgage manageable, chose a man who works in a brewery, who barely graduated high school, who approaches most situations with a combination of confidence and total incomprehension. The show has offered various explanations for this over the years: that Lois was attracted to Peter's uncomplicated nature, that she was rebelling against her background, that there was a genuine romantic chemistry between them that transcended material circumstances, but none of these explanations has been developed consistently enough to feel settled. What the show has suggested, in scattered episodes about Lois's past, is that she was not always the patient, relatively grounded woman she presents as in the show's present. There are hints of a wilder, more reckless Lois, a Lois who was drawn to dangerous situations and boundary-pushing experiences in ways that the current version of herself has largely suppressed. Peter, in this reading, is not a departure from Lois's character but an expression of a particular version of it, the version that wanted something unexpected, something that broke from the pattern of the life she was supposed to have. This framing makes the financial mystery more interesting. If Lois chose Peter partly as an act of self-definition against her background, then the Griffins' working-class circumstances are not a mistake or a mystery to be explained. They are the terms of a choice Lois made a long time ago and has been living with ever since. The stretched budget, the occasional crises, the gap between Peter's salary and the family's apparent lifestyle, all of this is the texture of the life Lois chose. And whatever Carter Pewterschmidt's notes say about $40,000, the choice was made by someone who understood the stakes. But there is another financial dimension to the Griffin household that the show has never fully addressed: Brian. Brian Griffin lives in the Griffin home, eats the Griffin's food, drives what appears to be his own car at various points, and participates in the household economy in ways that suggest he has some independent income. He has published or attempted to publish creative work. He has worked various jobs over the show's run. But his actual financial contribution to the household has never been clearly established, and the logistics of a dog with a social security number and a checking account are details the show has wisely chosen not to examine too closely. There is also the matter of the Griffins' consumer behavior as a family. The family eats at restaurants regularly. Peter and his friends have an active social life centered on the drunken clam that involves substantial regular expenditure. The children's school fees, extracurricular activities, and associated costs are real expenses that the show has acknowledged in occasional plot points. And yet the family is never visibly in debt, never facing the kind of genuine financial crisis that a family at their income level, with their spending patterns, in their housing market, would actually face. The invisible equilibrium is, again, a feature of the genre. But Family Guy has spent more time than most animated comedies gesturing at the reality of financial constraint, at the gap between what the Griffins have and what they need, without ever committing to what that gap actually feels like when you live inside it. The show visits financial stress as a plot device and departs from it as quickly as it arrived. Perhaps the most honest thing the show has ever said about the Griffin family's finances is Carter Pewterschmidt's note: 3 kids on $40,000. Good luck. The fact that the note exists, that someone wrote that line, included it in an episode, and let it stand, suggests that at least part of the creative team understood the arithmetic and chose not to make it work. Not as an oversight, as an acknowledgement. This is how it is. The math doesn't add up, and we all know the math doesn't add up, and the family keeps going anyway. Which is, when you think about it, a fairly accurate description of how a lot of actual families relate to their finances. The numbers never quite add up. The life keeps happening anyway. You make it work in ways you could not explain to an accountant. And every few years, something comes along, a windfall, an unexpected expense, a crisis that somehow resolves without destroying everything, and you reset to approximately the same position you were in before and carry on. The Griffins are not unusual in this regard. They are, in their financial chaos, extremely ordinary. It is part of why the show has always felt more grounded than its more outlandish elements might suggest. Beneath the talking dog and the time machine and the giant chicken, there is a family that cannot quite afford their house and keeps living in it anyway. And there is something deeply recognizable in that, something that the show has always understood even when it has not chosen to examine it closely. Section 9: Meg Griffin Parentage, Identity, and Purpose. In Season 13, in an episode structured as a crossover with The Simpsons, Meg Griffin meets Lisa Simpson. The two of them talk. Lisa, who is in many ways the show's clearest fantasy of what an intelligent, sensitive, overlooked child could be if the world treated her well enough, tells Meg that she has something, a talent, a quality, a potential that the people around her have been too busy or too self-absorbed to see. Lisa finds out that Meg can play the saxophone. She encourages her. She tells her she matters. It is, by some distance, one of the nicest things any character in either show's history has said to Meg Griffin, and it is, by the same distance, one of the most temporary kindnesses the show has ever extended to her. The next week, or the week after, Meg is back where she was. The saxophone is not mentioned. The encouragement has not left a mark on the family's behavior. The moment of recognition has been absorbed by the show's default setting, in which Meg is the least considered person in a household that has a lot of people competing for the title. Meg Griffin is, in many ways, the character whose mysteries matter most. Not because they are the show's most technically complex. Stewie's time machine is more technically complex. Quagmire's age is more numerically interesting, but because they are the most human. Who is Meg? What is her actual story? And what would the show look like if it had chosen to tell it? The parentage question is where Meg's mystery starts. In a Season 7 episode, the possibility is raised through a plot involving Stan Thompson, a man who was apparently in a relationship with Lois before Peter, that Meg may not be Peter's biological daughter. This was presented in a way that left it ambiguous enough to not be definitively resolved. The show introduced the question, played with it for an episode, and then set it down without a clean answer. Stan Thompson is, as a character, barely present in the show's mythology. He appears. He is described as a prior relationship of Lois's. The question of paternity is raised, and then he exits the show without leaving much trace. But the question he brought with him has never been fully closed. Is Meg Peter Griffin's biological daughter? The show's investment in the question seems, in retrospect, to have been primarily about the specific joke it enabled in the episode, where the question was raised, rather than about developing an actual storyline. But the implications, if taken seriously, are significant. If Meg is not Peter's biological daughter, it reframes their entire relationship not as a father who has developed, for complicated reasons related to his own history, a pattern of cruelty toward his child, but as a man who has always, on some level, suspected or known that this particular child is not biologically his, and who has processed that suspicion in the worst possible way. This is a darker story than Family Guy tends to tell, but it is not entirely outside the show's range. The show has gone to genuinely dark places with its characters when it wanted to, and the Meg-Peter relationship has always had a quality that goes beyond simple cartoon cruelty. There is something in Peter's treatment of Meg that feels, in the show's better episodes, like the expression of something specific, not generic meanness, but a particular directed hostility that seems to have a source that the show has never fully excavated. The Season 14 episode Peter's Sister provides what is, so far, the show's most developed attempt to explain Peter's behavior toward Meg. It is revealed that Peter's sister Karen was physically and emotionally abusive to him during their childhood, that Peter grew up as the target of cruelty from an older sibling, and that the cycle of that cruelty is part of what has shaped his treatment of Meg. Meg learns about this. She and Peter have a genuine emotional moment. Peter briefly seems to understand what he has done and why, and to feel something about it. This is good television. It is careful, emotionally intelligent writing that gives both characters real depth and creates a moment of genuine connection between them. And then the show moves on, and the cycle continues. The failure to build on this revelation is one of the show's most significant missed opportunities, not just for Meg's character, but for the show's overall emotional credibility. It established that the writers understood Peter and Meg's dynamic well enough to give it a coherent psychological cause. It established that Meg understood Peter well enough to respond to that cause with compassion rather than rejection. It established, in other words, the conditions for genuine change. And then it declined to follow through. Meg's identity questions go beyond her parentage. They extend into her aspirations, her social experience, and the show's persistent refusal to let her become anything. In the early seasons, Meg had clear, if modest, goals. She wanted to be popular. She wanted to be noticed. She wanted the ordinary pleasures of teenage social life that the circumstances of her family made difficult. As the show progressed and the cruelty toward her intensified, even these modest goals were undercut. The show didn't just fail to advance Meg's story, it actively degraded the starting position she had been in. In the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, one of the most discussed and most divisive episodes in the show's history, Meg finally delivers the speech that many viewers felt was the most honest and the most necessary thing anyone had said in the Griffin household in years. She lays out, with remarkable precision, exactly what her family has done to her and exactly what it has cost. She names the specific behaviors. She connects them to their specific emotional effects. It is the kind of clear-eyed, unsentimental accounting of damage that is genuinely difficult to write and genuinely difficult to watch. And then she takes it back. The episode ends with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily resuming her role as the family's designated target, on the grounds that, without her in that position, the family falls apart. She absorbs the cruelty so that everyone else doesn't have to. This ending has been analyzed extensively, and the analysis has not been kind. The message embedded in that conclusion that victims of sustained abuse should accept their victimization because their suffering provides a structural service to the people hurting them is one that the show did not appear to fully think through. Whether it was intended as dark satire, as a commentary on the dynamics of dysfunctional families, or simply as a way to return the show to its default configuration after an episode that had pushed further than normal, the effect was deeply troubling. The show told Meg, and by extension told the audience watching Meg, that standing up for yourself is an act of selfishness when the people around you have built their equilibrium on your pain. It is the kind of moment that is both explicable. The writers needed to return to the status quo, the episode had gone somewhere difficult, and the path back was this and genuinely wrong. Not wrong as a creative decision, exactly, but wrong in the sense of being false. The logic of that ending does not hold. Families do not actually require a designated victim to function. The cruelty toward Meg is not structural, it is chosen. It could be unchosen. The idea that removing Meg from the punching bag role causes the family to self-destruct says something about how the show had conceptualized the family that, on reflection, is more damaging than any individual episode of mistreatment. The evolution of the show's treatment of Meg in later seasons, the gradual pullback from the most extreme cruelty, the increasing presence of women in the writing room, the occasional episodes in which Meg is portrayed as competent and resilient rather than simply broken, represents a real change. It came late. It came incompletely. But it represents a recognition, somewhere in the show's production, that what had been done to the character had gone further than was good for the show or for anyone watching it. Meg deserved better. The show knew that, on some level, at least some of the time. The saxophone, the therapy episode, the Peter-sister reconciliation, these are the moments when the show seemed to remember who Meg was supposed to be and chose, briefly, to let her be it. That they were surrounded by so many seasons of something else is the mystery that Family Guy has the least satisfying answer to. Section 10. Peter Griffin's Physical Impossibility. Peter Griffin has broken his knee. Specifically, Peter Griffin has sat down on his own knee with sufficient abruptness that the knee has made a sound, and Peter has then spent what can only be described as an unreasonably long time sitting on the ground making a sound in response to the pain. This gag has appeared in several forms across the show's run. It has been stretched to lengths that surpass any reasonable definition of a punchline. It has become, in the show's later seasons, something of a symbol of the writer's willingness to fill time with physical comedy past the point of actual comedy. But the knee gag is, in a strange way, one of the most revealing things the show has ever done, because it draws attention to something that the rest of the show's physical comedy tends to obscure. Peter Griffin is, medically and physically, an impossible entity. He is described as obese. His weight has been given in various episodes as somewhere in the range of 260 to 270 pounds, which, distributed across his particular frame and body composition, represents a BMI that would carry significant associated health risks in any real human being. He drinks heavily and consistently. His relationship with Pawtucket Patriot Ale is one of the show's most fundamental character facts. A near daily intake that, measured over the show's run, would constitute alcohol dependence by any clinical standard. He eats in ways and quantities that the show has depicted with comedic exaggeration, but which, if taken at something approaching face value, would contribute to metabolic dysfunction of a fairly serious kind. And yet, Peter Griffin is one of the most physically durable characters in the history of animated television. He falls from buildings, he is struck by vehicles, he is beaten by a giant chicken in fights that last several minutes and involve impacts that would shatter bones. He is involved in explosions, industrial accidents, and medical procedures that are depicted with enough detail to establish that the events are real within the show's world, and from which he routinely emerges without lasting damage. The show has, on occasion, given this durability a partial explanation. In the Season 6 episode Petarded, it is revealed that Peter scores in the range of borderline intellectual disability on an IQ test, which the episode uses to qualify him for various legal protections. This is, in the terms of the show's comedy, a way of formalizing what had been the character's default setting, the idea that Peter operates significantly below average cognitive function. But cognitive function is not the same as physical resilience, and the episode doesn't attempt to explain why Peter survives things that should not be survivable. The more interesting physical mystery about Peter is not his durability, but his biology. Peter has, in various episodes, demonstrated medical conditions and physical states that contradict each other. He has been shown to have an extremely low pain threshold in some episodes, the knee gag, the way he responds to minor physical discomfort with extraordinary drama and an extraordinary pain tolerance in others, specifically the chicken fight sequences, in which he absorbs impacts that would be incapacitating without any visible reduction in his fighting capacity. He has been shown to have normal human physiology in episodes involving medical examinations, and has been shown to have abnormal physiology in episodes that require a joke about something weird happening inside his body. His cholesterol levels, his heart health, his liver function, these are all subjects the show has visited in individual episodes, and they have not always pointed in the same direction. One of the most significant medical mysteries about Peter is the question of whether the things that happen to him leave lasting effects. The answer the show gives, consistently, is no. Any injury, any condition, any physiological event that occurs in one episode is resolved by the next. This is standard animated television behavior, but Family Guy has pushed it further than most shows by depicting injuries with enough specificity, enough anatomical detail, enough apparent consequence to make the reset more jarring. In one episode, Peter loses several teeth. In the next episode, he has all his teeth again. In one episode, Peter sustains what appears to be a serious spinal injury. In the next episode, he is mobile with no reference to the injury. In one episode, a medical complication is described as potentially life-threatening. In the next episode, it is gone. The show is aware of this and has, in its self-aware later years, occasionally made jokes about it. Characters have noted that Peter seems to recover from things faster than is normal. The fourth wall has been gestured at in ways that acknowledge the show's own rules. But these acknowledgments do not resolve the underlying mystery. They just place it in a context that says, we know, this is what we are. Peter's relationship with alcohol represents the most sustained medical impossibility in the show's history. He has been depicted drinking Pawtucket Patriot Ale and various other alcoholic beverages in quantities that, if consistent across the 25-year run of the show, would have produced long-term health consequences. The show has visited alcohol-related episodes where Peter's drinking is treated as a problem, where Lois expresses concern, where the consequences of heavy drinking are at least partially acknowledged, but these episodes have never led to lasting change. The next episode, Peter is at the Drunken Clam with his usual glass. What is most interesting about Peter's physical impossibility is not the impossibility itself, but what it suggests about the show's relationship with Peter as a character. Physical consequence is the most basic form of accountability. The body keeps score, as they say, in ways that cannot be appealed or ignored. And the show has consistently absolved Peter of physical accountability in ways that parallel its absolution of him from other kinds of consequence. He does things. The things do not leave marks. The world resets. He does them again. This is, in part, simply the nature of Peter Griffin as a character type, the classic cartoon protagonist, the figure of comic irresponsibility who bounces back from everything because the show's comedy depends on him being available to bounce back. You cannot tell a new story about Peter Griffin's stupidity if Peter Griffin has been permanently affected by the last story about his stupidity. The reset is the condition of the genre. But there is something worth sitting with in the specific way Peter's body is treated. His physical invulnerability mirrors his emotional invulnerability. He cannot be hurt, not really, not lastingly, because a character who can be truly hurt is a character who can be truly changed, and a character who has been truly changed is no longer the same character you started with. Peter Griffin's body is the show's most literal expression of its refusal to grow. The knee hurts, and then it doesn't. The fall happens, and then it's over. The drinking continues, and the liver absorbs it. And tomorrow, Peter Griffin wakes up in his same house, in his same body, ready to do it again. He is, in this sense, a kind of immortal. Not the dramatic, literary kind, not the immortal who has seen centuries pass and carries their weight, the ordinary kind. The cartoon kind. The kind who wakes up the same every morning and lives the same afternoon and goes to bed the same night, invulnerable not because of any special quality, but simply because the story needs him to be there tomorrow. There is a piece in this, somewhere. The knee gag is not elegant comedy, but there is something almost meditative about a character who cannot be permanently harmed, who exists in a permanent present tense of physical experience, who absorbs what the world gives him and continues. It is not wisdom. It is not grace. But it is, in its own stubborn way, a form of endurance. Section 11. Lois Griffin. The mystery of who she actually is. There is a version of Lois Griffin's story that the show has never fully told, and it is possibly the most interesting story in the entire Griffin household. We know the surface. Lois Pewter-Schmidt grew up in a wealthy family. She met Peter Griffin, somewhere in the intersection of their lives. The details have been depicted in flashback multiple times, with varying levels of consistency, and she chose him over the objections of her family and the expectations of her background. She became Lois Griffin of 31 Spooner Street, the woman who plays piano and manages Peter and mediates between the children and keeps the household from fully dissolving into chaos. She is patient, usually. She is competent, almost always. She is the gravitational center of the family, the person around whom everyone else orbits, the person whose presence makes everything function with whatever degree of functionality the Griffin home achieves. This version of Lois is clear and consistent. It is the version the show depends on. But underneath it, in the flashbacks and the stray references and the episodes that have peeled back the surface to show what is underneath, there is another Lois. A Lois the show has glimpsed repeatedly without ever committing to exploring. In various episodes, we learn things about Lois's past that do not fit cleanly with the composed, patient woman she presents as in the present. There was a period of drug use. Cocaine appears in at least one flashback, introduced without much ceremony and then not much followed up on. There was a time when Lois was a groupie, following a rock band with the kind of dedication that implies a fairly different set of priorities than the ones she has now. There was, in at least one version of her history, a romantic or sexual encounter with Bill Clinton, which the show depicts with the same casual commitment it brings to all of its most implausible factual assertions. There was also a stint in a mental health facility. This has been referenced in more than one episode, and the context has shifted slightly between references. Sometimes it is framed as a brief crisis, sometimes as something more extended, sometimes as something that shaped Lois in lasting ways, and sometimes as something she has left entirely behind. The consistency of the reference across different episodes in different contexts suggests it is not a throwaway joke, but a real part of the character's history that the show has never fully examined. And then there is the matter of Lois's relationship with her own family, which is one of the show's most consistently interesting and most inconsistently developed threads. Carter Pewterschmidt is a man of considerable power and consistent unpleasantness. His relationship with Peter has been a source of comedy throughout the show's run. The contemptuous father-in-law who cannot understand why his daughter made the choice she made, who expresses his displeasure in ways that range from the petty to the genuinely harmful. But Carter's relationship with Lois is more complicated, and the show has approached it carefully in some episodes and clumsily in others. There is a suggestion, never made completely explicit, that Lois's childhood was not entirely comfortable despite its material privileges. That Carter's way of being in the world, dominant, dismissive, used to having his preferences override everyone else's, shaped Lois's early life in ways that made the warmth and emotional expressiveness she has as an adult seem, in a certain light, like an achievement rather than a default. That Lois has worked to be the kind of parent she is in response to something she experienced as a child. This is implied by the way Lois sometimes responds to Carter with a mixture of love and wariness, of genuine affection and a careful emotional distance that speaks to a history of disappointment. It is implied by the specific ways Lois worries about her own parenting, the particular anxieties she brings to her relationships with her children that echo the dynamics of her own upbringing in ways that are never quite made explicit. The character who emerges from all of this accumulated implication, the Lois who made unusual choices because her background had made conventional choices feel confining, who has a history of excess and of breaking rules, who has fought her way to the composure and the competence she projects, who came from money but chose something harder and has been making peace with that choice ever since, is a much more interesting character than the show has generally chosen to develop. Lois is in many ways the show's most capable person. She is the one who manages everything. She is the one who absorbs the chaos that Peter generates and keeps it from becoming catastrophe. She is the one whose judgment, when she exercises it, is usually right. And the show has occasionally explored what happens when Lois stops absorbing and starts expressing, when the management becomes too much and the patient woman shows what is underneath the patience. These episodes, when the show produces them, are some of its most interesting character studies. Lois angry, Lois selfish, Lois pursuing her own desires without filtering them through the family's needs, Lois as a person rather than a function. The mystery of Lois is the mystery of what she wanted before she became what she is. The flashbacks gesture at it. The stray references point toward it. But the show has never assembled these pieces into a sustained account of a person's life, of how a woman gets from the world she was born into to the world she chose. That story, told fully and carefully, would be one of the most compelling things Family Guy could produce. The show has the raw materials. It has always had the raw materials. It simply has not, in 25 years, chosen to build them into something. What remains is a woman whose surface we know intimately and whose depths we have only ever glimpsed. She plays the piano in the living room, and somewhere behind the music there is a history that the show keeps almost telling us and then doesn't. Section 12, Herbert's War, the most profound secondary mystery. There is an episode of Family Guy in its 9th season called German Guy. It aired in 2011. It is an episode about Herbert, the elderly man who lives down the street from the Griffins, whose affinity for teenage boys has been the source of a running joke since his introduction, whose slow shuffle and labored breathing and consistent presence in the neighborhood have made him one of the show's most visually distinctive recurring characters. German Guy is the episode in which Herbert is given a past. It is, by some distance, the most surprising and the most moving thing the show has ever done with him, and it is a story that, once told, cannot be untold, and which reframes everything about Herbert that came before it. The episode introduces Franz Schlecknacht, a German man who moves into the neighborhood and whom Peter befriends. As the episode develops, Herbert becomes increasingly agitated by Schlecknacht's presence. His reaction is not the casual discomfort of someone who dislikes a neighbor. It is something older and deeper and more specific. Eventually, Herbert reveals what it is. Herbert, we learn, was an Army Air Corps pilot during World War II. He flew missions over Europe. His plane was shot down over Germany. He was taken prisoner, but not to a standard POW camp. When the Germans searched his belongings and found photographs of boys, they concluded that Herbert was a homosexual, which, in the context of the Third Reich, was a classification that carried its own category of persecution. Herbert was sent to Dachau. At Dachau, Herbert was subjected to what the episode describes as torture. The torturer was Franz Schlecknacht. Let that sit for a moment. The man down the street who shuffles slowly and leans on his cane and calls out to the neighborhood boys in his distinctive elderly voice, that man survived a Nazi concentration camp. He survived the war. He came home. He built whatever version of a life was available to him in the America of the 1940s and 1950s, during a period when the same qualities that made him a target in Germany were also criminalized and persecuted in the United States. And he is still here, still in his house, still alive in whatever way he is alive, decades later. The episode handles this with more care than you would predict from a show that has, in other episodes, played Herbert's presence in the neighborhood primarily for uncomfortable laughs. The confrontation between Herbert and Schlecknacht is played straight. There is genuine weight in it. Herbert is not simply a comedy figure in this episode. He is a man with a history, a man who was harmed in specific and terrible ways, and who has been carrying that harm for 60 years, and who is now standing in front of the person who harmed him. The episode's ending, in which the conflict is resolved, in which Herbert is given a moment of something like justice, or at least of acknowledgement, is one of the show's most genuinely affecting conclusions. And then Herbert goes back to his house. And the next episode, he is shuffling down the street calling to the boys in the neighborhood. The mystery of Herbert is not, after German Guy, a mystery about his past. His past has been told, at least in outline. The mystery is about what that past means for how we understand his presence in the show's present. Herbert has survived things that most people do not survive. He has lived through historical events of extraordinary horror. He has outlasted the people who tried to destroy him and has continued, in some form, to occupy the world. The question that German Guy raises and does not answer is, who is Herbert now in light of what we know about him? How does his history shape the way he moves through Spooner Street? What does he see when he looks at the neighborhood around him? What does it mean to be a man with that specific biography, in that specific body, in that specific time and place? The show does not explore these questions, because Herbert's function in the show is primarily comedic, and the exploration of those questions would transform him into something that the show's comedic machinery could not easily use. The German Guy episode was a striking exception, a moment when the show chose depth over utility, and it was remarkable precisely because it was an exception. But the depth is there. The history is there. Herbert carries it with him in every shuffled step, in every slow sentence, in every scene on the porch. He is one of the most interesting characters in Family Guy's supporting cast, not because of the jokes he enables, but because of the life the show briefly and unexpectedly chose to show us, and then chose to place back out of sight. There are other things about Herbert that remain mysterious beyond his wartime past. His relationship with his dog Jesse, the aged, slow-moving dog who accompanies him in various episodes, is depicted with a tenderness that the show doesn't usually apply to secondary characters. His awareness of what goes on around him seems, at moments, to exceed what his presentation would suggest. He is not simply a figure of incapacity and age. He watches. He notices things. He has survived too much to miss very much. In the episodes that follow German Guy, Herbert returns to his established function. The war is not mentioned again with any frequency. The specificity of what was revealed is absorbed back into the show's general world, where it sits as a piece of information about a character that the show is aware of, but chooses not to foreground. This is, perhaps, the only way the show could handle it. To consistently engage with Herbert's history would require a different register, a different kind of storytelling than Family Guy typically operates in. The choice to tell the story at all was already an act of creative generosity. The choice not to build an entire revisioned character around it was, in the end, the show's concession to its own nature. But the history is real within the world of the show. Herbert was at Dachau. He came back. He is still here. And somewhere in the slow shuffle down Spooner Street, in the particular way he holds himself against the weight of time and experience, the history is present, not displayed, not performed, but there. That is the most honest thing Family Guy has ever said about the show's oldest character. The history does not go away just because it is not spoken. Some things are carried silently, and the carrying itself is the testimony. Section 13. The supporting cast's deepest unanswered questions. Spooner Street and its surroundings are populated by characters who have, over 25 seasons, accumulated their own histories, their own unresolved threads, their own quietly fascinating inconsistencies. The Griffins are the center of the show, but the world around them has depth that the show has added to over many years without always choosing to examine what it has added. Joe Swanson is the most immediately interesting of the show's recurring supporting cast from a mystery perspective because his character has been transformed so dramatically across the show's run, and the transformation has never been fully explained or examined. When Joe was introduced in the first season, in an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, he was the cool new neighbor, the man everyone admired, the disabled cop who was more physically capable and more professionally accomplished than his physical limitations suggested was possible. Peter was jealous of Joe. The neighborhood looked up to him. He represented a kind of competent, admirable masculinity that Peter was acutely aware of falling short of. Over the following seasons, that version of Joe was gradually replaced by a different one. The man everyone admired became the man everyone pitied, then the man everyone mocked. His disability, which in the early seasons was treated as one fact among many about a complex person, became increasingly the focus of jokes that diminished him rather than elevated him. Bonnie's dissatisfaction with their marriage became a recurring theme. The marriage went through multiple crises, survived them, and continued in a state that the show presented as one of managed disappointment. The mystery of Joe is not simply that his character changed. Many characters change over a long-running show's history. The mystery is that the change was so directional and so significant that the later Joe barely resembles the earlier Joe, and the show has never provided a coherent internal logic for how one became the other. The early Joe's confidence and capability were not performances, they were the core of who he was. Something would have had to happen to erode them as thoroughly as they were eroded, and the show has never shown us what that something was. Joe's son Kevin, discussed earlier in the context of characters who died and returned, is part of this larger question about the Swanson family. Kevin went to war. He was declared dead. He returned. The gap in between the experience of whatever actually happened to Kevin during that period is unexplored. What did Kevin's time at war, and his apparent death, and his return do to Kevin? What did the family's experience of mourning him and then having him come back do to the family? These are questions that a more character-driven show might have spent significant time on. Family Guy introduced them as plot elements and then treated them as resolved once the narrative utility of each element had been exhausted. Cleveland Brown's history with the Griffin family is another area of accumulated mystery. Cleveland was part of the original group Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland from early in the show, and his departure from the show to headline The Cleveland Show was both a natural extension of his character's developed backstory and a significant change to the dynamic of the core group. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy after his spin-off ended, the show treated his return with relatively little ceremony. He was simply back, the group was reconstituted, and the gap years of his life in Virginia were not extensively revisited. But those gap years exist. Cleveland's marriage to Donna, his relationships with his stepchildren, the community he built in Stool Bend, these are real parts of his history in the show's continuity, and they represent a version of Cleveland's life that he had, and then, by returning to Quahog, stepped away from. The Cleveland who returned to Spooner Street had lived through things that none of his friends had been present for. The show acknowledged this in some episodes and set it aside in others. The Swanson Brown Griffin Quagmire friend group, considered from a distance, is a collection of people whose friendships the show has consistently asserted, but whose dynamics have shifted considerably over the years in ways that raise genuine questions about what holds them together. In the early seasons, the friendship felt grounded in actual affinity in the show's early presentation of the Drunken Clam as a space where these particular people genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As the seasons progressed, the friendship became more of an assumption than an earned thing. The four men continued to appear together in the same space. But the sense that they actively chose each other's company became harder to sustain as each character became less generous toward the others. The mystery of the friend group is ultimately the mystery of most long friendships. What do people who have grown and changed in different directions actually share, beyond the fact of having known each other for a long time? The show has touched this question occasionally, in episodes that bring the tensions between the characters to the surface. Quagmire's famous speech about Brian being one example. The various episodes in which Peter's behavior toward Joe crosses the line and the friendship is strained. But it has never fully answered the question, perhaps because the answer would require acknowledging that these four men might not actually choose each other if they were meeting now for the first time. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's physician, whose medical competence exists somewhere between negligent and catastrophically absent, is a character whose consistent presence in the show raises questions about Quahog's medical infrastructure that the show has never addressed. Dr. Hartman has been the attending physician in situations that should have led to his license being revoked multiple times over. He has provided diagnoses that were obviously wrong, treatments that caused harm, and surgical interventions whose outcomes were far outside the range of acceptable medical practice. And yet he continues to practice. He continues to be the doctor the Griffins call. He continues to exist in the show's world as a functioning medical professional with a practice and patients. The mystery of Dr. Hartman is the mystery of Quahog's institutional life more broadly. The fact that the show's world contains professional and institutional structures that operate according to their own eccentric logic without any evident oversight. Quahog has a mayor. It has a police force. It has a functioning economy. It has restaurants and theaters and civic events. And all of these institutions function in ways that support the stories the show wants to tell, rather than in ways that would impose real-world consequence on the characters. Dr. Hartman is the medical equivalent of Peter's job at the brewery, a professional role that exists to provide story, material, and character context, rather than to represent a coherent account of how a person occupies that professional role. The characters around the edges of Family Guy's world carry, in aggregate, enough accumulated backstory and unexplored potential to populate several additional shows. Each of them has been added to in ways that were not planned from the beginning and have never been fully integrated into a coherent whole. Together they form the texture of a fictional town that feels richer and stranger and more layered than any one plotline or any one season could contain. This is, in the end, a kind of achievement. A world that has been built over 25 years by many hands, with no central plan and no unified vision, and that has somehow accumulated more than enough complexity to reward close attention even when the attention reveals more questions than answers. Section 14. The town of Quahog. Itself, what doesn't add up? Quahog, Rhode Island, does not exist. This is known. But the version of Rhode Island in which it is embedded is approximately the real state Providence is referenced as a nearby city. The geography is loosely consistent with actual New England coastal topography, and the cultural flavor of the setting is drawn from the specific texture of the post-industrial New England working-class town in ways that feel observed rather than invented. And yet Quahog accumulates impossibilities the way a coast accumulates driftwood steadily, without particular design, with the result that after 25 years the town is so layered with fictional history that its relationship to any actual place has become largely ceremonial. The population of Quahog has never been established clearly. In some episodes, the town reads as a small community where everyone knows everyone, where Peter's public behavior is noticed and commented on by the community at large, where local events are attended by the same recurring faces, where there is a genuine sense of a finite social world. In other episodes, Quahog is large enough to contain institutions, a stadium, multiple hospitals, a functioning entertainment industry, political structures that would require a population of considerably more than a small town could sustain. The Griffins neighborhood is simultaneously isolated enough that its particular residents form a meaningful social community, the friends next door, the bar within walking distance, the school close enough that the children can be depicted going there without the logistics of transportation, becoming a story element, and connected enough to larger structures that Peter can drive to Boston for an afternoon, or Lois can participate in civic events of a scale that would require significant public infrastructure. The history of Quahog, as the show has developed it, is one of its most interesting creative projects. The town was founded in the colonial era. Various episodes have depicted events from Quahog's past from the colonial period, through the Revolution, through the 19th and early 20th centuries with a consistency that suggests a shared historical mythology. The Griffin family's ancestors appear in these historical episodes, establishing that the Griffin connection to Quahog stretches back generations in ways that ground the family in a specific place with a specific past. But the history of Quahog is also, like most of the show's extended world-building, inconsistently maintained. Details established in one historical episode contradict details established in another. The show's relationship with actual Rhode Island history is loose enough that the overlap between Quahog's past and the real state's past is more atmospheric than substantive. The founding of the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, Peter's employer and the source of his particular brand of beer, is one of the show's more elaborated pieces of local history. And it is a history that has been depicted in multiple episodes with enough detail to suggest genuine thought about what the brewery means to the town. The brewery is not just Peter's job. It is an institution embedded in Quahog's economic and cultural life in ways that affect characters beyond Peter. It is part of what the town is. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends gather, is another institution that has accumulated meaning beyond its narrative function. Its regulars, its interior, its position on a particular street in a particular neighborhood, these details are part of the show's geography in a way that feels like real geography, like the way actual neighborhoods are defined partly by the presence of particular establishments that have been there long enough to become landmarks. What is interesting about Quahog as a setting is the way it has absorbed the show's history without becoming fully coherent. It is a place that has been lived in for 25 years, and it carries the marks of that habitation, the accumulated events, the changed buildings, the history of things that happened here. But it has also been reset and revised and adjusted so many times that it is impossible to assemble a completely consistent account of what the town actually is. This is, perhaps, the condition of any fictional place that has been occupied for long enough. The accumulated history creates richness. The resets and revisions create inconsistency. The combination produces something that is neither fully coherent nor fully chaotic, a place that feels real without being real, that has history without having a continuous history, that is home without being mappable. Quahog is, in this sense, the show's most honest metaphor for memory. We live in places that we remember imperfectly, that we know differently at different times in our lives, that accumulate meaning through experience without ever becoming fully known. The town where you grew up is not the same town it was when you were 7, and it is not the same town you tell people about when you explain where you are from, and it is not the same town that people who have never been there imagine when you name it. It is all of these things at once, and the version that is most real is the one that exists in a kind of composite, a place assembled from fragments of experience and memory and accumulated feeling that does not correspond exactly to any single moment or any map. Quahog is that kind of place. It is the Griffin's home, and ours by proxy, and it does not need to be fully coherent to be fully theirs. Section 15, Every Loose Thread, the Final Accounting. We have been moving through this world for some time now, and the night has deepened around us, and there are still threads we have not followed to their ends. Some of them do not have ends that the show has provided. Some of them never will. But in the spirit of being thorough, in the spirit of sitting with the show's incompleteness and finding in it something other than frustration, let us account for the remaining questions. The smaller mysteries, the threads that have been hanging from the show's fabric since it was first woven. Start with Stewie's accent. Stewie Griffin speaks with an accent that is generally described as British, specifically as a kind of received pronunciation that has been associated with a particular class and educational tradition in England, a voice that sounds like it was trained at a public school and polished on BBC radio. The show has acknowledged this directly in multiple episodes, with characters either commenting on the accent or with Stewie himself making references to it. The question that the show has never cleanly answered is, where did the accent come from? The most obvious answer that Stewie is mimicking something he encountered through media, through television or radio or some other audio source is available but unsatisfying, because the accent is too consistent and too natural to be an imitation. It does not wobble the way an imitation would. It is not deployed, it is inhabited. Stewie does not speak with a British accent the way someone does a party trick. He speaks with it the way a person speaks in their native voice. The show has gestured, in certain episodes, at the idea that Stewie's accent is connected to some aspect of his identity that is more fundamental than mimicry, that it is somehow continuous with the sophisticated intelligence and the theatrical manner and the particular quality of consciousness that makes Stewie who he is. There is a suggestion, in episodes that touch Stewie's inner life most directly, that Stewie experiences himself as belonging to a different category of entity than the one his physical circumstances place him in. The accent is the voice of who Stewie thinks he is, which is not the infant in a Providence, Rhode Island home, but something older, stranger, more finely wrought. This does not answer where the accent came from. It only makes the question more interesting. Then there is the matter of Bonnie's voice, which changed between early episodes and later seasons in ways that the show did not address. The earlier version of Bonnie was higher-pitched, more fragile, seeming in its quality. The later version settled into a different register. Voice actors sometimes adjust their performances over the course of a long show, and changes of this kind are normal in the production of animation. But in a show that has otherwise addressed continuity questions when they serve narrative purposes, the unremarked evolution of Bonnie's voice is one of those small details that catches the ear of viewers who have been paying close attention. There is the question of Quahog's connection to Providence, which the show has used inconsistently. Sometimes Providence is a nearby city that characters can visit for an afternoon. Sometimes it seems further away, a more significant journey. The geography shifts to suit the story, which is fine, it is fiction, but it means that the physical relationship between Quahog and the rest of Rhode Island is one of the show's most persistently elastic facts. There is the question of Stewie's room, which has contained, at various points, more advanced technology than should fit in a standard child's bedroom, and more technology than should be physically possible to build given the materials available to a one-year-old. The show has occasionally tried to explain where Stewie stores his equipment by suggesting that his room has more space than it appears to have, that there are rooms within rooms, or that his laboratory exists in a space that is larger on the inside than the outside, in the tradition of classic science fiction. But this explanation has been applied inconsistently, and in episodes where a more accurate spatial account of Stewie's room would require addressing the question of where everything goes, the show has generally chosen not to ask. There is the question of Brian's writing career, which is one of the show's most deliberately cruel ongoing jokes and also one of its most psychologically accurate observations. Brian has been working on a novel for essentially the entire run of the show. The novel is never finished. It is, in the show's later seasons, explicitly terrible. Not just unfinished, but also bad, a fact that other characters have gone out of their way to establish, and that the show has treated as a source of comedy at Brian's expense. The mystery is not whether Brian will finish the novel we know. The answer to that is almost certainly no, but what the novel would actually be about if it were finished. The show has given glimpses of Brian's literary ambitions, of the kind of writer he imagines himself to be, and the kind of work he imagines himself producing. A completed novel by Brian Griffin would be a fascinating artifact. The show has never provided it. There is the question of Meg's eventual life, of who she becomes after the show ends, of whether the resilience she shows in the better episodes about her is enough to carry her somewhere. The show is still running, so the question is not yet fully closed. But the trajectory the show has put her on in its most recent seasons, the move away from sustained cruelty and toward something more balanced, the episodes in which she is allowed to be competent and strong, suggest that the show has at least been trying to write a better future for her than her past would predict. Whether that future arrives on screen or is simply implied by the direction of the current is something only time will tell. There is the question of what Quahog looks like from space, of what kind of world the Griffins actually inhabit, what the physics of their universe actually are, whether the magical and the impossible events that occur with regularity in their town represent a different fundamental nature of reality in their world, or are simply the show's convention of treating the impossible as possible. The show has never committed to a cosmology, and this is probably wise, because any specific answer would constrain future stories in ways that no answer does not. But the absence of an answer leaves the question hovering, what is this world actually? What are the rules, really? And the answer, which the show has always known and never needed to say aloud, is that the world is whatever the story needs it to be. This is not a satisfying philosophical answer, but it is an honest production answer. And in 25 years, the show has earned the right to let it stand. Now let me account for the questions about Chris, which the show has almost entirely declined to develop. Chris Griffin is, in many respects, the show's most empty vessel, a character defined primarily by his position in the family, his awkwardness, his resemblance to Peter in body type and general orientation toward the world. He has had his own episodes, his own storylines, his own moments of genuine feeling, but across the full run of the show, Chris remains the Griffin family member about whom the fewest interesting questions have been raised and about whom the fewest interesting answers have been provided. This is partly a function of his age and position as the middle child in years. Between Meg and Stewie, he occupies a narrative space that the show has found difficult to fill. Meg has her suffering. Stewie has his intelligence and his machines. Peter and Lois have their marriage. Brian has his pretensions and his friendship with Stewie. Chris's art, which the show has occasionally developed. He has a talent for drawing that has been a recurring fact about him, and Chris's social anxiety, and Chris's deep voice, and Chris's persistent inability to understand the world around him at anything approaching the level the world requires. The art is, in retrospect, one of the show's most underused threads. A character with genuine artistic talent in a household defined by a particular kind of practical blundering should generate interesting friction between the impulse to create and the environment that doesn't know what to do. With creation, between the sensitivity that artistic perception requires and the numbness that survival in the Griffin household seems to demand. The show has touched this occasionally. It has not built it into anything. Chris also has, in the show's mythology, a relationship with an evil monkey that lives in his closet. The evil monkey, one of Family Guy's most memorable visual jokes from the middle seasons, was eventually given a backstory that humanized it in unexpected ways, resolving the gag with something that approached actual emotional resonance. The evil monkey is gone now, its story told. But its years in Chris's closet raised a question the show never answered. What did Chris know about the monkey? And what did the presence of a creature that only he seemed to fully believe in do to the way he understood his own perception of reality? If no one else took the monkey seriously, and Chris was the only one who saw it regularly and feared it, then Chris spent years of his life in genuine distress about something he couldn't convince his family was real. That is a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of a fear that no one validates, of a perception that you cannot share. The show treated it as a running gag. The gag, if you look at it from Chris's perspective rather than the audience's, was genuinely harrowing. A child afraid of something in his closet, unable to make the people around him believe it was there. And then the monkey got a backstory, and it turned out to be a real creature with a real story of its own, and Chris had been right all along. He was not imagining it. He was not confused. He saw what was actually there. There is something almost triumphant in that, buried under the comedy. Chris was right. He always was. Nobody believed him, and he was right. This is, in its quiet way, one of the show's most satisfying resolutions of a long-running thread. And it is almost entirely accidental. The monkey's story was not planned from the beginning, and the emotional implication of Chris having been vindicated was not the point of the resolution. But it is there, and it is real, and it belongs to Chris Griffin in a show that has not given him much that is entirely his own. The loose threads of Family Guy, considered in aggregate, are not primarily evidence of careless production. They are evidence of a show that has been alive for long enough to accumulate more than it can fully integrate, a show that has added and added and added to its world without always having the capacity to weave everything it added into a seamless whole. The seams show, the threads hang, the contradictions persist, and there is, honestly, something beautiful in this. A show that had no loose threads would be a show that was entirely resolved, a show in which every question had been answered, every mystery had been cleared up, every character had arrived at a clean and stable destination. Such a show would also be a show that was finished in the deepest sense, a show with nothing left to discover, nothing left to wonder about, nothing left to bring you back to it with the feeling that there might be something you missed. Family Guy, for all its inconsistencies and its declining quality in certain eras, and its frustrating refusal to develop its characters as fully as they deserve, Family Guy is not finished. It is still accumulating. It is still adding threads to a fabric that already has more than it knows what to do with. The questions it has generated over 25 years will not all be answered in the remaining seasons it has been promised. Some of them will never be answered at all, but they will remain questions. And questions, in the right state of mind, in the state of mind you are in right now, late and quiet and letting the world slow down around you are not a frustration. They are an invitation. An open door in a house you have known a long time that you have never walked through. A room you have passed many times without stopping. Stewie is in his crib. The time machine is on the floor. Brian is asleep in the kitchen. Peter is watching television. Lois is upstairs, doing whatever Lois does in the quiet hours when no one needs managing. Meg is in her room with the door closed. Chris is in his room with his sketchbook. Somewhere down the street, Herbert is sitting in the dark with the weight of a very long life. And across town, in a house the show has never shown us, a chicken in a suit is sitting at a dinner table, and his son is asking him about his work, and outside the window the town of Quahog is exactly as large and exactly as small as the story needs it to be. The questions are there. They will be there tomorrow. They will be there the next time you come back to this show, to these characters, to this particular small corner of a fictional world that has been alive for longer than many actual things. Let them be there. Let them breathe. There is nothing that needs answering tonight. Closing until next time. If you made it here through the time paradoxes and the impossible ages and the expired coupon and the man who survived things that should not be survivable and is still shuffling down the street, then you have spent a considerable amount of time in very good company, and I am genuinely grateful for it. Family Guy is a show that rewards this kind of attention. Not because it was designed to. It was designed to make people laugh, and it has done that for 25 years with varying degrees of success. But because any living thing that persists for long enough develops a kind of complexity that surpasses its original design. The show has mysteries not because it planned them, but because it has been alive, and alive things accumulate. If this helped you rest, if it kept you company on a sleepless night, if it gave your mind something gentle to follow while the day let go, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Leave a comment if you are still awake. Tell me where you are, what time it is, what question from tonight stayed with you. I read them all. Subscribe if you want more of this. There are other shows with other mysteries, other worlds with other questions, other late nights ahead. Sleep well. The chicken fights will still be happening tomorrow. The time machine will still be in the corner. The questions will all still be there. They are not going anywhere. Supplementary Section A. The Griffin Marriage. What nobody has ever fully explained. There is a particular quality of mystery that lives inside long marriages, the accumulation of shared experience that no outside observer can fully access, the private language of reference and habit that two people develop over years of proximity, the way a couple can be entirely legible from the outside in some moments and entirely opaque in others. Family Guy's central relationship, the marriage between Peter and Lois Griffin, has this quality in an unusual degree, not because the show is particularly subtle about it, but because it has been running for long enough that the relationship has developed its own genuine archaeology, its own layers of history that press against each other in ways that are difficult to fully resolve. The official version of how Peter and Lois met has been told in multiple flashback episodes, and it has been told differently each time. This is not unusual for Family Guy. The show's relationship with its own backstory is consistently elastic, but the Peter-Lois origin story has been revised and elaborated and partially contradicted enough times that assembling a coherent account of how they came together is a genuinely interesting exercise in creative archaeology. What is consistent across the various versions? Lois was from money. Peter was not. They met during a period when Lois was, by various accounts, somewhat at odds with the expectations of her background, looking for something that the life her family had mapped for her didn't offer. Peter represented something unplanned. Something outside the expected sequence of educated courtship and appropriate match that the Pewter-Schmidt world presumed. What is inconsistent? The specifics of the first meeting, the early stages of the relationship, the exact nature of the obstacles they faced. Different flashback episodes have placed their courtship in slightly different contexts and given it slightly different emotional textures. The version of Peter who courted Lois in one flashback is not quite the same man as the version of Peter who courted Lois in another, and the Lois who responded to him is similarly variable. The most dramatically significant backstory element to the Griffin marriage is one that the show has addressed carefully and then mostly declined to fully develop. Lois's relationship with Peter's best friend Brian. Brian had feelings for Lois. This was part of his character from early in the show, handled with enough restraint in the first few seasons to be touching rather than uncomfortable. Brian knew that Lois was Peter's wife and that his feelings were not appropriate to act on. He carried them quietly. They surfaced occasionally in ways that were more poignant than comic: a look, a moment, a sentence that meant slightly more than it should have. As the show progressed and Brian's character underwent the changes described earlier, this thread became more complicated. The later Brian's pursuit of women carried, at its edges, traces of the early Brian's feelings for Lois, a man looking for something in his romantic life that he had identified first in someone who was unavailable. The show has gestured at this connection without explicitly drawing it, which is one of the more interesting pieces of psychological writing Family Guy has produced. Peter's awareness of Brian's feelings for Lois is another question the show has handled inconsistently. In some episodes, Peter seems genuinely oblivious he trusts Brian completely, and does not appear to register Brian's behavior toward Lois as anything unusual. In other episodes, there is a flash of something beneath Peter's surface, a moment of awareness that gets suppressed almost as soon as it appears, because fully acknowledging it would require a kind of emotional processing that Peter is not equipped to do. The Peter and Lois marriage has also been subjected to the show's habit of generating crises and resolving them without lasting consequence. They have separated briefly. They have faced the specific pressures that the show applies to marriages, infidelity questions, communication failures, the weight of long intimacy, and they have survived all of them, returning to their default configuration after each one. The marriage, in the terms of the show's logic, is indestructible. It is one of the show's load-bearing elements, one of the things the world depends on being there. It will not be broken in any final way. But what holds it together is the mystery. Not the comedy mystery of how they got together that has been told in its various versions, but the deeper mystery of what the marriage actually is in its daily texture. What do Peter and Lois actually give each other? What need in each of them does the other meet that no one else could? These questions are answerable in general terms: companionship, stability, the long comfort of being known, but they are not answerable in the specific terms that the show has established, because those terms point in directions that are complicated. Peter is difficult. He is worse than difficult. The later Peter in particular is a man whose behavior would strain any reasonable marriage to its breaking point, and yet Lois stays. This is treated by the show as an axiom: Lois stays, the marriage continues, the family persists, rather than as a choice that requires ongoing examination. But choices that appear axiomatic are always the most interesting ones when examined, because the absence of apparent deliberation in them is often evidence of something very deep rather than something very simple. Lois stays because she loves Peter. This is the show's answer. And in the moments when Peter is the earlier, warmer, more genuinely present version of himself, it is an answer that holds. But in the episodes where Peter is at his worst, most cruel, most irresponsible, most completely absent as a partner or a father, the show offers that same axiom without fully engaging with what it means to choose to stay in something that is genuinely harmful. The mystery of the Griffin marriage is ultimately the mystery of commitment, of how people stay and why, of what holds two people together across the kind of history that this particular marriage has accumulated. It is not a mystery the show has ever tried to solve, because solving it would require the kind of sustained examination of its central relationship that the show's format does not easily accommodate. But it is present in every episode, in every interaction between Peter and Lois, as a background hum the question of what this is, exactly, and whether it is enough, and what enough would even mean. Supplementary Section B. The show's relationship with its own history, meta-mysteries, and the self-aware show. Family Guy is one of the few long-running shows in television history that has developed a sustained, explicit awareness of its own mythology, its own inconsistencies, and its own declining quality, and has built jokes around this self-awareness in ways that reveal something genuinely interesting about how the show understands itself. The show knows things about itself that most shows would not acknowledge. It knows that Stewie's character changed dramatically from the early seasons. It knows that the cutaway gags have multiplied beyond their original function. It knows that some of its storylines have been recycled, that some of its jokes have been repeated, that some of its narrative choices have not been universally welcomed. And it has, in its later seasons, chosen to engage with this self-knowledge directly to fold its own production history into the text of the show itself. This is a particular kind of meta-comedy that Family Guy has made its own. When a character breaks the fourth wall and references the show's declining quality, or when the show includes a joke about having run too many seasons, it is not simply acknowledging the criticism, it is positioning itself as the knowing subject of that criticism, as a show that is in on the joke about itself. The implication is that a show aware of its own problems is somehow less culpable for those problems than a show that is not aware of them. This is an interesting philosophical position. Whether it holds up is another question. Knowing that you are making a mistake and making it anyway is not in most contexts an excuse for the mistake. But in the context of comedy, self-awareness functions differently. It is almost a grace, a willingness to take the blow before the audience delivers it, which neutralizes some of the impact. The show that laughs at itself first is harder to devastate with outside criticism because the criticism has already been incorporated. The most elaborate piece of self-referential storytelling in the show's history is the Back to the Pilot episode, in which Stewie and Brian actually return to the first episode of the show and interact with their Season 1 counterparts. This is the show examining its own origin, literally looking back at who these characters were at the beginning and comparing them to who they have become. The episode does not flinch from this comparison. It allows the differences to be seen. It makes the observation that the earlier versions of the characters were different, and it does not entirely romanticize that difference, but it does acknowledge it as a fact of the show's history. The episode also generates the paradox discussed in the Time Machine section, the problem of older Stewie and Brian interacting with their younger selves, and what that does to the timeline. But at its emotional core, it is about something different. It is about a show that has been running long enough to have a past worth returning to, long enough to have characters whose earlier versions are now distinct enough to be visited as other people. It is about 25 years of history compressed into a comedy episode about a football-shaped time machine. There is also the recurring device of characters referencing the show's structure, directly commenting on the length of a gag, anticipating where the plot is going, noting that something feels like a finale or a bottle episode. These moments break the fictional frame in ways that the show uses as comedy, but which also function as genuine acknowledgments of what Family Guy is. A television production that has been going on for a very long time, and that is made by people who are aware of every convention they are following and every rule they are breaking. The self-aware show generates its own category of mystery. When a show knows enough about itself to comment on its own faults, what does that knowledge obligate it to do? The answer Family Guy has given is nothing, necessarily. Knowing and changing are not the same thing. The show knows what it is. It keeps being what it is. The knowing is the courtesy extended to the audience, the acknowledgement that we see what they see, but it is not, in itself, a promise of change. And yet, the self-awareness has, over the show's run, occasionally been more than a courtesy. There have been moments where the show's engagement with its own history has led to genuine creative reflection episodes that use the show's long run as subject matter in ways that produce something more interesting than nostalgia or self-congratulation. The Brian death storyline, whatever its conclusion, was a moment of genuine engagement with what it would mean for the show to lose one of its central characters. The episodes that have revisited Stewie's evil genius period, even in the context of acknowledging that this version of the character is mostly retired, have shown a willingness to sit with what was lost. The mystery of the self-aware show is the mystery of whether awareness changes anything. In Humans, the relationship between self-knowledge and behavior change is complicated. Knowing what you do is not the same as being able to stop doing it, and insight does not automatically produce transformation. In a television show, the relationship is even more complicated because the show's behavior is determined not by a single consciousness, but by the distributed decisions of a large group of people working across many years. Self-awareness in this context is not a unified state. Different people on the show understand it differently, value different things about its past, have different ideas about what it should be going forward. What the show knows about itself is, in the end, as inconsistent as everything else about it. Different episodes know different things. Different seasons have different degrees of self-awareness about different issues. The show is not a unified consciousness capable of genuine reflection. It is an ongoing production. and its self-awareness is itself partial, variable, and shot through with the same inconsistencies that characterize the rest of its relationship with its own history. But the attempt matters. The episodes that engage with the show's past, with its characters' histories, with the question of what it has been and what it still might be, these episodes represent the show at its most genuinely ambitious. And the fact that they are scattered among many episodes that do not share that ambition is not evidence against them. It is evidence that the ambition is still alive somewhere in the production, still present, still occasionally finding its way to the surface. Supplementary Section C: the sound of Family Guy, the voices, the music, and what they carry. There is a dimension of Family Guy's mysteries that is easy to overlook because it is experienced rather than analyzed, the dimension of sound, of voice, of the specific sonic texture that the show has built over 25 years, and that carries its own kind of meaning and its own kind of question. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire. 4 of the show's most important characters are produced by a single voice, a single vocal instrument that creates 4 entirely distinct presences. This is not unusual in animation. Voice actors routinely perform multiple characters, but the specific fact of MacFarlane's 4-way presence in the show creates a particular kind of unity at the show's center, a sense that these 4 characters are, at some level, expressions of a single sensibility even when they are in opposition to each other. When Peter and Brian argue, and they argue often, across the show's run they are, in one sense, 2 characters in conflict. They are also, in another sense, one voice in conversation with itself. MacFarlane performing both sides of the argument, finding the comedic truth in both positions, is doing something that has no exact equivalent in live-action performance. A kind of internal debate rendered as external dialogue, a conversation between different aspects of a single creative consciousness. This has implications for how we understand the show's central relationships. The Peter-Brian friendship, which is one of Family Guy's most consistent emotional cores, is also the show's most intimate relationship in a production sense. It is, at every recording session, MacFarlane performing both halves of the connection. The affection between Peter and Brian is, in this light, partly a form of self-affection, a warm relationship that the show's creator maintains with different parts of his own sensibility, rendered as 2 characters who love each other despite having almost nothing in common. Brian's voice measured, slightly formal, with a dry quality that signals intelligence without quite performing it, is the show's voice of aspiration. It is how MacFarlane would like to sound, perhaps, if not for the other things he has decided to be. Peter's voice, louder, less controlled, driven by impulse rather than reflection, is how MacFarlane might sound if he had never had any of the things that produce the aspiration. The 2 voices are in conversation because they represent genuine aspects of a personality that contains both. Stewie's voice is something else. The crisp British accent, the theatrical precision, the way each word lands with a sense of considered placement, this is the show's most literary voice, the one that reaches most explicitly for a tradition of wit and verbal elegance that Family Guy does not always manage to meet. Stewie sounds like someone who read the right books and loved the right comedies and developed a voice in response to them, and the gap between that voice and the body it comes from the diaper, the high chair. The organic context of infancy is one of the show's most durable comic premises. Quagmire's voice occupies a different register, the one that is closest to performance, to persona, to the gap between what a person projects and what they are. The giggles, the catchphrase, the particular cadence of someone who has been doing a version of the same thing for a very long time and has it refined to a specific pitch. Quagmire sounds like someone who discovered early that a certain kind of presentation worked for getting what he wanted and has been deploying it ever since. There is something almost hollow in the voice. Underneath the performance, an indication of depth that the performance is designed not to reveal. 4 voices, 1 instrument. The show has been, in a very literal sense, a sustained piece of vocal performance art, MacFarlane's exploration of different ways of being through the medium of animated character. The mysteries of these characters are, in this light, also the mysteries of a single creative life reflected through multiple prisms. The music of Family Guy is another dimension that carries meaning that is not always explicitly discussed. The show has a strong musical tradition, not just the show-stopping production numbers that appear in various episodes, but the background scoring, the use of existing music as character shorthand, the specific ways that musical choices have been used to deepen emotional moments that might otherwise land differently. The original theme composed by Walter Murphy, who has scored the show throughout its run, has a particular quality of cheerful confidence that has remained consistent across the show's many different eras. The theme does not communicate anxiety or complexity or the show's accumulated inconsistencies. It communicates something simpler: a family, a town, a particular kind of American domestic life, and a particular kind of Sunday night animated comedy register. It is the sound of the show being sure of itself, which is interesting given how much the show has been unsure of itself in practice. The musical episodes, the ones that have built entire storylines around original songs or elaborate theatrical sequences, represent Family Guy at its most formally ambitious, and they have often been among the show's most ambitious creative achievements. The ability to produce something like a Broadway production number within the context of an animated comedy series that is also making jokes about other things requires a kind of simultaneous seriousness and levity that the show has managed better in some cases than others. When it works, and it has worked, in particular episodes scattered across the show's run, it reveals a register of the show that the standard episode format does not access. The register of genuine spectacle, of entertainment that knows it is entertainment and leans into that knowledge with full commitment. The music also carries something that the dialogue and the visual comedy do not: direct emotional statement. When a Family Guy musical sequence works, it is because the music has allowed the show to say something directly that the comedy format would otherwise deflect or complicate. The show's various expressions of genuine affection between Peter and Lois, between Stewie and Brian, between Brian and the family he lives with, are often most clearly expressed in musical contexts, where the emotional register is elevated enough to accommodate sincerity without the comedy routine immediately stepping in to undercut it. This is one of the show's most interesting qualities, and one of its most under-discussed. Family Guy has a genuine emotional life that it tends to hide behind the comedy, and the music is one of the places where that emotional life surfaces most directly. The show is not as cold as its reputation in certain quarters suggests. It cares about its characters. It has always cared about them, even when it has not been treating them well. The music is the clearest evidence of this, the place where the care breaks through the comedy and says something unambiguous. The voices, the music, the 25 years of accumulated sound, this is another kind of answer to the question of what Family Guy is. Not the analytical answer, not the plot and character answer, but the felt answer. The show as an experience of listening. The specific texture of what it sounds like when these particular voices occupy these particular spaces. And in the dark, late at night, letting it play in the background as sleep comes closer and the questions become softer and the edges of everything relax, this dimension of the show is perhaps the most important. Not the answers to the mysteries, not the resolution of the inconsistencies, just the voices, just the music, just the familiar sounds of a fictional world that has kept us company for a very long time. The world Stewie builds his machines in, that Brian drinks his wine in, that Peter gets into trouble in, that Lois manages and Meg endures and Chris draws in, it sounds like something specific. It sounds like home, in the way that a thing you have known for long enough always sounds like home. Not your home exactly, but a home, a place where the voices are familiar and the music is recognizable and the questions are the same questions every time. Let them be familiar tonight. Let the voices be soft. Let the music be whatever it needs to be. The mysteries are there. They will be there tomorrow. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Supplementary Section D, 25 Years on Spooner Street. What the show has actually said about time. There is a thing that happens when you watch a show for long enough that has no precise name in criticism, though its effects are familiar to anyone who has experienced them. The show becomes part of your timeline, not in the superficial sense of being a thing you watch during a certain period. Everything you've seen or read or experienced during a certain period attaches itself to that period in memory, the way songs attach to summers or smells attach to places. The experience of a long-running show is different. It is distributed across time rather than placed in it. It exists in the odd, non-linear space of ongoing fiction simultaneously continuous. The characters and world persist from episode to episode, Season to season and discontinuous, the show stops and starts. There are gaps and breaks, and the life you live between episodes is not the life the show is living. Family Guy has been in this relationship with its audience for 25 years. For people who watched from the beginning, in 1999, the show has now been present for a significant portion of their lives. For people who found it during the Adult Swim reruns, or when it came back in 2005, or through DVD sets or streaming, the relationship began at a different point, but has had similar depth for those who stayed with it. The show has been there inconsistently, imperfectly, increasingly frustratingly, and occasionally brilliantly through whatever those years contained. This is, in a strange way, one of Family Guy's most significant achievements. Not the Emmy nomination, not the ratings records, not the cultural impact of specific episodes or characters. The achievement of having been there, of having been a reliable presence across a quarter century of human experience, available and recognizable, and carrying the specific quality that made it what it was, even through all the changes, is the achievement that most long-running shows fail to notice about themselves because it does not appear on any metric. What has the show actually said about time over the course of this relationship? It has said, by its very structure, that time is not linear. The floating timeline, the device by which the characters do not age as the show's production years advance, makes a particular claim about the nature of the fictional world. It says that time in Quahog flows differently than time in the world where the audience lives. The Griffins are not aging. They are not moving through the same sequence of years that their viewers are moving through. They exist in a kind of eternal present, renewed each season, experiencing events that are contemporary with their broadcast but not sequential in the biographical sense. This is common to animated television, as noted. But Family Guy's version of the floating timeline has a specific texture that distinguishes it. The show has accumulated so much history, so many referenced past events, so many characters with developed backstories, so many episodes that depend on the audience's knowledge of what came before, that the floating timeline no longer floats quite as freely as it might in a show with less accumulated mythology. The show is not timeless. It is time-laden. It carries its past in ways that make the non-aging of its characters feel more like a convention under increasing pressure than a settled fact of the fictional world. Stewie's Time Machine is the show's most direct engagement with time as a subject. By giving one of its characters the ability to move freely through history, to visit the past, to alter it, to return to the present, to navigate the paradoxes that follow the show, created a vehicle for exploring its relationship with its own history. The Back to the Pilot episode is the clearest example, but almost every Stewie time travel episode is, at some level, the show examining its own temporal relationship with itself. What does it mean to be able to go back? In Stewie's case, it means being able to undo mistakes to return to the moment before something went wrong and make it go differently. This is an extraordinary power, and the show has been selective and interesting in when it chooses to deploy it. Brian's death is undone. Other things are not. The principle of selection, the unstated logic of what is reversible and what is not, is one of the show's deepest unspoken commitments, and it reveals something real about what the show values and what it can bear to lose. The show's relationship with its own past is also visible in the way it uses nostalgia. Family Guy generates nostalgia more effectively than most of its contemporaries, not just the nostalgia of characters referencing popular culture from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, but the meta-nostalgia of the show itself becoming the object of nostalgic feeling. People who watched the early seasons in 1999 or in the early 2000s now carry those episodes the way people carry anything they loved in their youth, with a warmth that has more to do with where they were when they encountered it than with purely aesthetic judgment. The show knows this. Episodes that call back to the early seasons, that revisit the configurations and tones of the show's first years, are exercises in shared nostalgia. They ask the audience to remember not just the show, but themselves, the people they were when these characters first became familiar. This is an intimate thing to ask, and Family Guy asks it with varying degrees of grace, but the asking itself represents a kind of honesty about the relationship the show has built with its audience. It is not merely entertainment, it is memory. It is the place where certain moments of your own life are stored. What the show has said about time, in its totality, is this: time passes, and the things you love do not stay exactly the same, and the gap between what something was and what it is now is a real gap that carries real feeling. The early seasons of Family Guy are not available as experiences to people who watch the show today for the first time. Those episodes can be accessed, they are streamable, they are on DVD, they are findable, but the experience of watching them as new episodes, as the current expression of a show that did not yet know what it was going to become, cannot be recovered. That experience belongs to the people who had it at the time. It is part of their personal history, not the show's general history. This is the deepest truth about long-running fiction. The text persists. The experience of the text is unrepeatable. You can watch Season 1 of Family Guy in 2025 and appreciate it on its own terms, but you cannot watch it the way someone watched it in 1999 with no foreknowledge, with the characters fresh, with the show's future entirely open and unwritten. Every viewing is retrospective. Every episode is colored by the history that followed it. The show you are watching is not the show that existed then. It is a version of it filtered through everything that came after. This is not a loss exactly. It is a transformation. The show you carry with you, the emotional residue of years of watching, the specific episodes that stayed with you, the characters who came to feel like known quantities is a different thing from the show itself, and in some ways a richer thing. It is the show as it has been metabolized into your own history, as it has been made continuous with your own timeline, even though its fictional timeline floats free of yours. Family Guy has been metabolized by millions of people across 25 years, in millions of different ways. Each of those metabolizations is a real relationship, a real piece of someone's emotional and cultural life that the show has been allowed to be part of. The mysteries of the show, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, these are part of what made the metabolization rich. A smooth, fully resolved, internally consistent show would have been easier to exhaust. The rough edges, the dangling threads, the questions that do not have answers, these are the parts that give you something to return to, something to turn over in your hands on a quiet night. Something to wonder about while the hours pass and the world outside is dark and still. 25 years on Spooner Street, 25 years of the same house, the same neighborhood, the same characters navigating the same impossible arithmetic of their existence. The Griffin family has not aged. The show's audience has. And somewhere in that gap between the characters who stay the same and the people watching them who don't is where the real mystery lies. Not in the plot inconsistencies, not in the timeline contradictions, not in the question of who can hear Stewie or how old Brian really is, but in the act of watching. In the relationship between the show and the life you live while watching it. In the way certain things come to matter not because they are great but because they are familiar, because they have been there, because they have kept you company through whatever the years brought. That is what Family Guy has done for 25 years. It has kept company. Imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes frustratingly, sometimes brilliantly, but continuously. And continuity, in the end, is its own kind of grace. The house at 31 Spooner Street is still there. The lights are on, the voices are familiar, the questions will still be there tomorrow. Let the night come, let the sleep come. The show will be there when you wake up. Supplementary Section E. The ones who watch and the world they watch from. Before this ends entirely, before the questions are set down and the night takes over completely, there is one more dimension of Family Guy's mysteries that deserves time. Not the mysteries within the show, but the mystery of the watching itself. Who are the people who keep coming back to this show? The question sounds simpler than it is. The obvious answer, people who find it funny, is true but incomplete. Family Guy has never been short of critics who find it unfunny, and many of those critics are not wrong about the things they criticize. The show's later seasons have been, by various measures, less carefully crafted than the earlier ones. The characters have changed in ways that are not universally improvements. The humor has shifted in directions that have not pleased everyone who loved the early version, and yet people watch. The ratings decline, as documented and as real as it is, still represents millions of viewers. The streaming numbers, which are not the same as broadcast ratings, and which the networks have been reluctant to publish in full, suggest a continued engagement with the show's back catalog that the declining first-run ratings do not capture. People find Family Guy through different paths now than they did in 1999. They discover it on Hulu or through clips on social media or through someone they know who pushed them toward a particular episode. And a portion of them stay. What keeps them? Part of it is the cutaway gag in its ideal form, the perfectly timed, unexpectedly absurd reference that creates the specific kind of delight that comes from being surprised by a joke you didn't know was coming. Even in the show's later seasons, even when the cutaways have become over-reliant and the individual quality has been diluted by volume, there are still cutaways that land with the clarity and timing of the best early ones. The show still produces moments genuine, clean, well-constructed comedic moments with enough frequency to reward the watching. Part of it is the characters, in their various states of development and deterioration. Even an imperfect version of a character you have known for years carries meaning that a new character cannot. You watch Peter Griffin in a later season not because this is the Peter Griffin you fell in love with, but because this is the most recent version of a person you have been watching for 2 decades. The continuity creates investment that transcends quality in individual episodes. Part of it is the world, the specific texture of the Quahog setting, the specific quality of the show's visual and sonic identity, the sense of a place that has been inhabited for long enough to feel real, in the way that only very long occupation makes fictional places real. And part of it, perhaps the part that is hardest to articulate but most important, is the company. The show at its best has always been good company. Not perfectly good company, not reliably good company, but the kind of company that you keep, not because every conversation is great, but because the relationship has accumulated enough warmth over enough time that even the bad conversations happen within a context of overall affection. This is, in the end, what Family Guy has always been offering. Not just jokes, not just story, not just character, but company. The specific feeling of not being alone, of having something familiar in the room with you, of hearing voices you recognize talking about a world you know. It is a simple thing, in a sense. It is also a profound thing. The capacity to provide genuine company, to be reliably present in the way that real companions sometimes are not, to be available at 2 in the morning, or on a sick day, or in the quiet hours between midnight and sleep, is not a trivial achievement. The people who watch Family Guy late at night, in bed, with the audio low and the room dark, the people watching it right now, wherever they are, and whatever time it is, are participating in something that has been going on for 25 years, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. They are part of the long relationship between this show and the people it has kept company. Their watching is not passive. It is a form of participation in an ongoing thing, a collective act of keeping something alive by continuing to engage with it. The mysteries of Family Guy are shared mysteries. The questions that have accumulated over 25 seasons are questions that many people are holding simultaneously, in different places, at different hours, with different levels of engagement. Somewhere tonight, someone is watching the episode where Brian dies for the first time, not knowing what comes next. Somewhere, someone is watching the German Guy episode and being surprised, as viewers always are, by what Herbert's past turns out to contain. Somewhere, someone is watching the pilot, the very first episode, the one that aired after the Super Bowl in 1999, and seeing it fresh, before all the accumulated history of the show has been layered over it. All of these watchings are happening in the same ongoing present. The show is not a fixed monument that can be visited at any time and found the same. It is an experience that exists differently for each person who has it, at each point in time, in each state of prior knowledge or ignorance. The mysteries are not solved for any of these watchers. The questions persist. The timeline does not add up. The chicken fight continues. And in the dark, with the questions floating at the edge of sleep, with the familiar voices receding into background sound, and the breathing slowing and the thoughts going soft in this particular moment, in this particular state, the mysteries are exactly right. They are exactly what they need to be. Open, present, available to be picked up again tomorrow. The house on Spooner Street is dark now. Everyone is in their place. Stewie is in his crib with his plans for tomorrow, his time machine in the corner, his accent carried in sleep. Brian is wherever Brian goes when the night gets quiet. Peter is dreaming the kind of dreams that simple, impossible men dream. Lois is resting after another day of managing the unmanageable. And the questions hang in the air above the house like stars, each one a point of light, each one a mystery that has been there long enough to seem permanent, each one a small and beautiful thing that does not need to be answered tonight. Sleep now, rest now. The questions will be there in the morning. They have been there for 25 years. They are not going anywhere. If you made it to the end of this, through every mystery, every paradox, every unanswered question the show has left hanging in its long and complicated run, then you are exactly the kind of person this was made for. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the company. Subscribe if this is a place you want to return to. Leave your time and place in the comments. I read everyone. Sleep well. Good night. And one last thing for the viewers who came for the mysteries and stayed for the silence. Family Guy has never been just a comedy. It has been a world. A poorly mapped, internally inconsistent, paradox-riddled, emotionally uneven but somehow genuinely inhabited world. The kind of world that only exists when people keep choosing to return to it, season after season, question after question. The kind of world that earns its permanence not through perfection but through presence. Thank you for returning to it tonight. The doors on Spooner Street are all closed. The lights are all out. The town is asleep. So are you, if the night has done what nights are supposed to do. Until next time, a note on watching in the dark. There is a specific quality of attention that comes in the late hours, when the day's urgency has finally drained away, and what remains is a quieter, more receptive kind of awareness. The mind at 2 in the morning is not the mind at 2 in the afternoon. It is looser. It follows things for different reasons and in different ways. It is more willing to sit with questions that do not have answers, more able to let things be unresolved, more open to the specific pleasure of not knowing. This is why long-form content about fictional worlds, content that does not demand active engagement, that does not require you to track a plot or hold information for later use, works so differently late at night than it does during the day. During the day, your relationship with information is productive. You are processing it for some purpose, extracting what you need, filing the rest. At night, particularly in the hours just before sleep, the relationship becomes something different. The information washes over you rather than going through you. You absorb texture and impression rather than fact and argument. You feel the shape of things rather than measuring them. Family Guy, watched in this state, becomes something other than a comedy show. It becomes a presence, a set of familiar voices in a familiar world, speaking in ways you do not need to fully attend to because you have heard them often enough that they carry meaning without requiring active interpretation. The jokes do not need to be consciously processed to do their work. The characters do not need to be analyzed to provide their comfort. They are simply there, and their being there is enough. This is the show at its most pure, stripped of the critical apparatus. Stripped of the comparison to what it used to be, stripped of the tracking of inconsistency and the noting of contradictions. Just the voices and the world and the particular texture of a place you have known long enough that knowing it takes no effort. The mysteries we have explored tonight are real mysteries. The questions we have asked are genuine questions. But they are best held lightly. They are best carried in the way you carry things late at night loosely, without grip, letting them drift where they drift while the sleep comes. So let them drift now. Let Stewie's accent remain unexplained for one more night. Let Brian's age stay unresolved. Let the chicken fight continue on its own terms, in its own logic, with its own strange inevitability. Let the timeline fold and contradict itself. Let the Griffin family live in their financially impossible house with their impossible relationships and their unanswered questions and the time machine in the corner. They do not need your help tonight. They never did. They have been managing the impossibility of their existence for 25 years without answers, and they will manage it tomorrow. The questions will still be there when you come back to them. But right now, in this particular darkness, in this particular quiet, you do not have to hold them at all. Let them go. Let the night take them. Sleep well.